North Koreans weeping and wailing, collapsing in mourning after learning of the death of Kim Jong-il.
This reaction may seem extreme to you, but to the people of North Korea, they were mourning their god. North Korea, the tiny isolated country with the capabilities of mass destruction. With hostile relations in the West and increasing tension, will the Kim dynasty survive? The civilians adore and worship their communist dictator. Or is this all a show? From the country's founding in 1948 to the modern-day totalitarian regime, this is the entire history of North Korea. The birth of North Korea, 1946 to 1953. Japanese-occupied Korea. The entire Korean peninsula was under Japanese occupation after 1905. Japan's occupation was unquestioned by foreign powers, and it presented its occupation as a civilizing project. For the Koreans, the story was quite the opposite. Thousands of guerrilla fighters bitterly resisted Japan until 1910, when they were all but destroyed and Korea became fully part of the Japanese Empire. The story of Japanese-occupied Korea is one shared by many colonies. Industrialization and economic expansion came with discrimination against the native peoples, as wealth and resources were siphoned away to the imperial masters. The initial guerrilla resistance was over, but the resentment of the Koreans did not go away. Japan ran Korea like a military colony, with armed teachers in schools and a massive militarized police force overseeing all aspects of life. Also, like many colonies, they longed for independence. With the end of the First World War and all its promises of freedom, Korea agitated for its independence. Protests swept the nation in 1919, which the Japanese put down brutally. In one case, they locked hundreds of protesters inside a church and burned them alive. However, the tide couldn't be stemmed. The wave of Korean nationalism rose, and at its head were the communists. The rise of Korean communism. Communist movements were common across the world in the early 19th century. Galvanized by the success of Vladimir Lenin in the Russian Revolution, the communists promised wealth redistribution, an end to profit-seeking and imperialism, and a new prosperous beginning for its people. Time would put those promises to the test, but the dream of the communist utopia enchanted countless people, especially in Korea. Korean communists quickly became the tip of the anti-Japanese spear. Numerous guerrilla and civil groups emerged in the 1910s, 20s, and 30s, trying to achieve an independent communist Korea. The Japanese responded with firing squads, prison time, and terror. This killed many guerrillas and forced others to flee, including a young man the world would come to know as Kim Il-sung. The rise of Kim Il-sung. Kim Il-sung was born in 1912 near Pyongyang. His early life is drowned in later propaganda, but it seems he was raised by Christian parents who escaped into China when he was still a child after getting involved in anti-Japanese activity. In China, young Kim fell in love with communist ideas. China had its own active communist movements, which Kim joined as soon as he was able. In 1931, he became a card-carrying member of the Chinese Communist Party and got involved with anti-Japanese protests and militant action. When Japanese forces invaded Manchuria in 1931, Kim joined the resistance, hoping to drive Japan out of China and eventually his homeland. Kim proved to be a successful guerrilla leader. He quickly worked his way up the ranks with successful strike after successful strike, operating in both China and Korea. In 1937, he led 200 guerrillas in the Battle of Po-Chon-bo, just across the Korean border, where his forces defeated Japanese soldiers and burned down a police station and other occupied buildings. The victory put Kim Il-sung on the map and made him one of the most famous guerrilla leaders in East Asia. For later North Korean propaganda, it was the true start of Kim's path to power. Kim himself wrote about the battle saying that, quote, "The The flames over the night sky of Pochanbo in the fatherland heralded the dawn of the liberation of Korea, which had been buried in darkness. Kim and the Soviets. Kim's success earned him the nickname of the Tiger. The Japanese military sent out units to hunt him down and may have killed his secret first wife, which forced Kim to retreat into the Soviet Union, where he was officially enrolled in the Red Army and spent most of the Second World War in hiding. When the USSR declared war on Japan in 1945, Soviet armies marched into the Korean peninsula. Kim followed shortly after. At the same time, US forces landed in the south. After evicting the Japanese occupiers, the Allied powers decided to split Korea, much as they had done Germany. American officials chose the 38th parallel, a previously meaningless line on a map, as the boundary between the two occupied zones. This line, apparently chosen in half an hour by two random American colonels, would become one of the most important borders in the world for the next 80 years. Korea had no natural north-south division, and everyone wanted a united Korean peninsula, under their particular ideology, of course. The Soviets knew they would need a reliable Korean communist leader to achieve this, and Stalin personally chose the greatest of the Korean communist guerrillas for the job. In December 1945, Kim Il-sung became first secretary of the Communist Party of Korea, giving Kim power over his nation that he would hold for the next 50 years. The Kim deception? Kim had risen from lowly guerrilla fighter to leader of his nation, or had he? A bizarre conspiracy theory claims that the Kim Il-sung who entered North Korea in 1945 was not the same one who led the Battle of Pochanbo. According to this theory, after the real Kim Il-sung fled into the USSR, Stalin made him disappear like so many other communist figures who threatened his popularity. It sounds crazy, but a CIA investigation into the theory concluded that it was right. They believed that the Kim Il-sung in North Korea was a criminal who the Soviets blackmailed into assuming a false identity so they could manipulate him. A Soviet officer who worked with Kim also wrote privately that the later Kim was an imposter, whose name was stolen from the famous guerrilla leader who had actually died years earlier. These days, historians think the theory is nonsense. Several people who knew Kim as a guerrilla confirmed that it was the same man. The CIA report had simply been wrong, which happens far more often than the CIA likes to admit. Still, it's not impossible that the entire Kim dynasty is built on a Soviet lie. A divided Korea. Kim the guerrilla and Kim the first secretary were probably the same, but no such unity existed for Korea itself. Under two contrasting governments, the Korean peninsula became a flashpoint for the new Cold War between communism and capitalism. In the south, General John R. Hodge ran the U.S. Army's military government of Korea, while Kim acted as the figurehead for a Soviet-backed government in the north. Historians have often overstated the power of the Soviets in the north. Modern scholars accept that after 1946, Kim Il-sung and the North Korean Workers' Party were leading the way in setting North Korean policy. Kim began a series of communistic reforms in his nation. In March 1946, he began seizing land from landlords without compensation and redistributing it to the people, remaking the North's economy in a matter of months with thousands of new small peasant holdings. He set out a 2-year economic plan to guide production and investment, relying on new levels of state control over the economy and a focus on heavy industry. All industry, banks, communications, and transport infrastructure was nationalized. And in July 1946, Kim introduced a sexual equality law that guaranteed equal working rights for women. The reforms were successful, and North Korea saw an incredible economic recovery in the first few years after 1945. Divided communists. All was not easy within North Korea, though. Different factions of communists threatened Kim's control, and each tried to push North Korea in their own direction. Kim's Kapsun, or guerrilla faction, held power for now. As the name implies, they were mostly made up of former guerrilla fighters whose effectiveness had earned the faith of Stalin. But Stalin's faith was awfully fragile. This made the Soviet Korean communists a particular threat. Made up of ethnic Koreans with Soviet citizenship, they leaned heavily towards Moscow. While they hadn't proven their effectiveness enough to earn Stalin's favor, the heavy involvement of the Soviets made them a risky rival for the young Kim regime. Then there was the Yunnan faction. This was a Chinese-aligned communist wing, most of its members being part of the CCP. After Mao's communists took power in China in 1949, the Yunnan faction became a potent threat to Kim's Korea-centric approach that threatened to pull North Korea towards Beijing. Last, there were the South Korean communists. Many had fled the south when the American troops arrived and made it their main goal to reunify the peninsula under communist rule. They were less of an immediate threat until reunification was achieved, but their leader, Park Han-young, was the closest thing Kim had to a rival. Park and Kim had both been invited to Moscow in 1946 for Stalin to judge which was the suitable leader. While Kim had won out, Park remained a force to be reckoned with. Foundation of KPA. Unsurprisingly, Kim anchored himself in the military. He'd been a guerrilla fighter for decades and made it a huge part of his ideology. So much so that the foundation date of his anti-Japanese guerrilla force, April 25th, became an annual holiday. This guerrilla force was officially transformed into the Korean People's Army, known as KPA, in February 1948. Conscription was in place from the outset, which meant that the KPA has always been a formidable force. Arming such a massive army was a tall order, but the USSR ensured that it was done by pouring weapons, tanks, planes, and artillery into North Korea. With huge numbers and modern equipment, the KPA was one of the most powerful military forces in the post-war world. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea is born, 1948. Meanwhile, the newly formed United Nations tried and failed to settle the Korean Peninsula problem. The USSR opposed free elections and refused to cooperate with the UN, believing that they were puppets controlled by the US. The UN proceeded to hold elections only in the south, and on the 15th of August 1948, the Republic of Korea, that being South Korea, was born under the leadership of Syngman Rhee. As far as the UN was concerned, this was the only true Korean government. North Korea responded by writing their own constitution. On the 9th of September, they declared themselves as the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, with Kim Il-sung as premier. North Korea, as we know it today, was finally here. The Korean War invasion. Almost immediately, Kim started planning the reunification of the peninsula. With most American troops withdrawing in June 1949 and the vastly superior northern military at his fingertips, it looked like an easy win. Communism had also seen a string of recent victories that boosted Kim's confidence too. The USSR detonated their first atomic bomb in August 1949, which ended America's unchallenged nuclear supremacy. In China, Mao's communists overthrew the Republican government and gave him another communist ally. Both Stalin and Mao threw their support behind an invasion, and Mao sent at least 50,000 men from the People's Liberation Army to support him, although Stalin was clear that he would not send in the Red Army. The South expected a war. There were several clashes in 1950 that proved hostility between the two Koreas. Then, on 25th of June 1950, North Korean tanks, planes, and infantry poured over the border in a massive assault. The Northern Army outnumbered the poorly equipped South 2-1, its Air Force by more than 10-1, and North Korea's almost 300 tanks met a grand total of 0 units of South Korean armor. South Korea utterly collapsed. Within 5 days, Kim controlled Seoul. almost 80% of South Korea's army was captured, killed, or had deserted, and the tiny handful of US troops on the peninsula could do nothing but run in the face of the North's overwhelming advance. As they went, North Korean forces targeted ideological enemies in South Korea. Politicians, anti-communist intellectuals, and business leaders were systematically exterminated by the KPA. Kim Il-sung was beyond pleased. It appeared he'd won a great victory, but that euphoria was short-lived. The Korean War, US retaliation. The United Nations condemned the invasion immediately, and 2 days later, it approved a unified military response to the crisis. Naturally, the US took the lead. Washington was worried that the fall of Korea to communism would threaten Japan and cause a domino effect in the rest of Asia. General Douglas MacArthur, who'd led US forces in the Pacific theater of World War II and currently oversaw US forces in occupied Japan, was given overall command of the UN coalition forces. UN forces landed at Incheon on the 15th of September, 1950. In the largest amphibious assault since World War II, the UN attack shattered the KPA. The North Korean front collapsed, and tens of thousands of KPA soldiers were captured. The UN quickly retook Seoul, and by the end of September, had pushed back to the 38th parallel. By that point, most of North Korea's army had been killed or captured. In October, UN forces pushed into North Korea itself. Kim and his government were forced to flee, and Pyongyang fell to UN forces within weeks. What had looked like a victory was quickly becoming a total defeat. The Korean War, strategic bombing. For North Korea, the true story of the war was not on the front lines, but at home. As its armies collapsed, so too did any hope of controlling the air. UN-aligned air forces quickly established dominance in the skies above North Korea and used it to devastating effect. The US Air Force led a colossal bombing campaign that devastated North Korea's population and infrastructure. Entire cities were flattened. Villages were wiped off the map. Pyongyang was so badly bombed that not a single major building was left standing. The US general in charge of the Air Forces said that, by October 1950, the Air Force stopped sending bombers out simply because there was nothing left to bomb. An estimated 80% or more of North Korea's buildings were flattened, as more explosives were dropped on North Korea than were dropped in the entire Pacific theater in World War II. Maybe 10% of the North Korean population was killed by the bombing. It is this experience, more than anything else, that shaped North Korean attitudes to the US after the war. Whatever ideological disagreements they might have, and whatever nonsense propaganda the regime puts out, it is the near total leveling of North Korea by US bombing that explains the sheer hatred for the USA that pervades the North Korean state and society. The Korean War, Chinese intervention. Things improved for North Korea when China stepped in. China had warned the UN forces not to get too close to its territory, and on the 25th of October 1950, they decided that enough was enough. Tens of thousands of Chinese troops burst across the border and surprise attacked the UN forces. The UN was caught unaware and retreated in the face of the sudden attack. Chinese and North Korean forces quickly recaptured Pyongyang, pushed the UN back over the 38th parallel, and even retook Seoul for a short period. Kim Il-sung's feelings were mixed. On the one hand, North Korea was back under his control, but the strength of the UN forces made reunification unlikely. Kim resented the loss of so many of his troops and the fact that China was doing most of the fighting. Furthermore, both Stalin and Mao blamed the KPA for being too incompetent to win and causing the war to spiral out of control. UN forces soon regrouped and pushed back. Seoul was retaken in March, its fourth and final conquest in less than a year, and once again it was the communists' turn to retreat north with thousands of their soldiers killed, wounded, or captured. The UN reached the 38th parallel again in July 1951, and there, the war would stall for 2 brutal years. The Korean War, Stalemate, and Armistice. From July 1951 to July 1953, the Korean War was a stubborn stalemate that was as grueling and frustrating as the trenches of the First World War. Casualties continued on both sides, but no significant territory changed hands. After several failed attempts to negotiate, both sides finally came to an agreement on the 27th of July, 1953. It was not a peace treaty, but an armistice. Both sides agreed to halt military operations, release prisoners, and return the remains of the deceased. The armistice set up an internationally monitored demilitarized zone, the Korean DMZ, along the border to mark the boundary between the two nations. The war has been left unfinished ever since. Skirmishes and episodes of violence have broken out, but for the most part, North and South Korea have been locked in a tense standoff that has threatened to spill over into a devastating war at any moment for the last 70 years. The rebirth of North Korea, 1953 to 1970. North Korea emerged from the war a broken and battered nation. Its army was almost destroyed. Its cities were in ruins. Its population was exhausted and demoralized. Kim Il-sung and his regime now faced the monumental task of rebuilding their country and navigating the perilous Cold War world. It was a task that required a fresh start, a rebirth of North Korea for a brand new age. Rebuilding a nation. The war devastated North Korea socially and economically. Overall economic output fell by 75% from 1949 to 1953. Output of energy, fuel, chemicals, metallurgy, and agriculture was a fraction of what it had been before the war. North Korea needed a rebirth, and Kim Il-sung set out the ways in which they'd achieve it. In 1953, he clarified 4 goals that would guide the nation in the coming years. First, he would consolidate what he called the People's Democratic System. In simpler terms, this meant doubling down on communist ideology and ramping up the propaganda to ensure that everyone was a loyal citizen. Second was to rebuild the economy and improve people's living standards. With much of the country in ruins, this was an obvious goal, but it would be a monumental task. Still, with total control over the economy and the support of their foreign allies, Pyongyang was confident it could be achieved. Third was to improve national defense. The army had to be rebuilt. The border had to be properly fortified, and they needed to secure modern equipment to stay competitive in a changing world. Last but not least, the unending goal of reunification remained. Kim's hopes had been shattered during the war, but he and other North Koreans remained convinced that it was possible. North Korea had its work cut out for it. Post-war purges. One of Kim's first priorities was repairing the damage his ideology took from the war. The North Korean Workers' Party had lost many members during the conflict, so he funded massive re-education programs to bolster the party's ranks and reaffirm their ideology, ensuring the party's long-term survival. However, the more serious damage was to the North Korean Worker Party's prestige. The Communists had presided over a failed war that had not reunified the country as promised, and communism itself had been rejected by the South Korean masses, who failed to rise up to support their northern invaders. Kim decided to redirect blame for those failures towards his internal rivals. By scapegoating his enemies, Kim redirected popular resentment away from himself and towards the rival communist factions. By removing these people from power, he crippled his internal enemies and could fill government positions with his own allies instead. It was transparent and predictable, but it was awfully effective. The Soviet Korean communist leader Ho Kai-I faced Kim's wrath towards the war's end, when he was purged of his posts and blamed for a series of failures in the country's response to the war, especially the slow repairs of dams and infrastructure bombed by the Americans. The accusations drove Ho Kai-I to suicide, or so the regime claimed. Another victim was Kim's old rival Pa Kon-yong. The leader of the South Korean Communist faction had been appointed foreign minister and had promised Kim that the Southerners would rise up and join the North when their communist forces rolled in. This obviously did not happen. Kim dismissed him from his post in 1953 and then had him arrested on accusations of being an American spy. Only disloyalty, the regime argued, could explain such a complete failure. He was given a show trial and executed in December 1955. Hundreds of communist figures found themselves fired, imprisoned, or executed in the months after the war in a similar fashion, and Kim's grip on power became ever tighter. Juche ideology. With Kim's power almost unchallenged, it fell to him to decide how North Korea would proceed. He formulated an ideology that would guide his country into the future, an ideology called Juche. Juche was and remains the guiding principle of the entire country. Its elements were first expressed in a 1955 speech by Kim Il-sung, and it essentially means self-reliance. North Korea strives to be militarily, socially, and economically capable of standing on its own 2 feet. Cooperation with fellow socialist states was welcome, but dependence undermined the country's power. Economically, this meant a rejection of international trade as the path to prosperity, and a focus on self-sufficiency. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea would strive to grow all of its own food, develop all of its own technology, and extract all of its own raw materials. Socially, it meant a thorough education in Juche ideology for all citizens, and an insulation from outside ideas that might compromise the ideological unity of the nation. All of this, of course, was in a Marxist-Leninist framework, but Kim stressed that Korean thought and experiences should determine how those Marxist-Leninist ideas would be applied in practice. Juche also defined the North against the South. For Kim, the North was a fiercely independent nation that stood on its own, while the South was an American puppet shackled to its trading partners and military alliances. However, Juche is more than a practical philosophy. It's also an intense love of North Korea. One historian of North Korea described Juche as an assumption that Korea is at the center of the world. All citizens of the Democratic People's Republic of Korea must passionately love their country, and by extension, its leader. Understanding Juche is the key to understanding modern North Korea. Kim's cult of personality. North Korea had a goal and a means of attaining it, but it also needed a center to anchor the whole system, and Kim made himself that center. The 20th century was already no stranger to dictators whose personality cults consumed their nations, but Kim Il-sung's cult would put all of them to shame. The level of worship Kim and his descendants receive in North Korea to this day is one of the most striking and disturbing aspects of the regime. At first, Kim was following in the footsteps of his contemporaries like Mao and Stalin. In 1953, he declared himself Sir-Yong, or Great Leader, and became a sort of embodiment of the nation. However, that amount of power and prestige could make anyone unhinged. Furthermore, by becoming the representative of the nation, any attack on Kim became an attack on North Korea. And in a country that emphasized loyalty to the nation, loyalty to the dictators was an inevitable consequence. This cult quickly grew out of control. It became illegal to write over a photo of Kim Il-sung, or to wrap things in newspapers that mentioned his name. It was even an offense to print his photo on poor quality paper. The August Faction Incident. However, the ruler cult almost brought Kim down before he really began. After the death of Stalin, the USSR took a hard pivot against leader cults. In February 1956, the new Soviet leader Khrushchev openly denounced Stalin and his personality cult, along with any other leaders who tried to emulate it. Still dependent on Soviet aid and support, Kim was forced to obey when Khrushchev summoned him to Moscow to be privately scalded for his own ruler cult in the summer of that year. In his absence, Soviet and Yunnan communist factions hatched a conspiracy. They shared Khrushchev's disgust with the ruler cult and called Sung out for his arbitrary punishment of dissenters. They also criticized his regime's economic policies and his bias towards his own guerrilla faction of communists. When Kim returned for the annual party meeting in late August, he was met with condemnation by the leaders of the other factions. Pak Chang-ok, leader of the Soviet faction, and Cho Chang-il, leader of the Yunnan faction, along with several of their allies, took to the stage at the party conference and tore into Kim as a tyrant and egomaniac whose actions were undermining socialist principles. But Kim's enemies had miscalculated. The Soviet and Yunnan factions were too anchored in the USSR and China for their support. Meanwhile, Kim was a nationalist hero, a true Korean who had fought the guerrilla fight to free his nation. For many, Kim represented Juche, self-reliance, while his enemies would submit North Korea to the powers of foreign nations. At the party conference, Kim's critics were shouted down. They overestimated their support, and the party voted to expel Cho Chang-il and Pak Chang-ok. Over the following months, dozens of leaders from both factions disappeared as Kim purged everyone he could lay his hands on. It is unknown how many people died, but it was so bad that Beijing and Moscow sent a joint delegation pleading with Kim to stop the purges. Kim simply ignored them. Most just disappeared. They were forgotten in hard labor camps or shot and buried in an unmarked grave. About 11 people were convicted in show trials and executed as enemies of the state. By 1960, Pak and Cho were dead. The Soviet and Yunnan factions had been completely destroyed, and there was no one left in North Korea who would dare challenge Kim Il-sung's power. The 3-year plan, 1954 to 1957. With politics dealt with, Kim turned towards economic issues. In August 1953, he set out his vision for a 3-year plan to run from 1954 to 1956. Kim laid out investment plans to boost the nation's economy. Heavy industry was the main priority, with over 80% of all industrial investment going to sectors such as mining and construction. The plan also set out extensive quotas for every industry and directed workers to devote themselves to laboring for the state. According to Pyongyang, it was a success. Industrial and agricultural production had returned to their pre-war levels by early 1957. However, external observers noted that the numbers were probably skewed. Thanks to all of that investment, heavy industry had probably improved beyond pre-war levels. But vital industries like agriculture and fishing had not. In reality, the focus on quotas and output had devastating consequences. Like China during the Great Famine, the regime exacerbated its own problems with its focus on quotas and numbers. Regional officials who failed to meet agricultural quotas were punished, so officials were incentivized to lie. This continued at each level, lie piling upon lie, leaving Pyongyang with a completely warped view of the country's actual state. This was especially bad for farmers who would have food seized by the state based on exaggerated reports of food output, which produced a famine in 1955 that killed thousands of people. This disaster was hidden from the non-communist world, but Pyongyang's allies in Beijing and Moscow were deeply concerned. The truth about the famine could harm communism's image abroad. Both countries sent food aid, but not enough to make up for the deficit. The regime worked hard to bury all evidence of this famine, and it was only in the 2000s when historians began combing through the Soviet archives that its existence was rediscovered. Data is incomplete, but an estimated 800,000 people died between 1954 and 1955. The East German government at the time believed that as many as 25% of North Korea's children had starved to death. The 5-year plan. Declaring the plan a success, Kim followed it up with a 5-year plan from 1957 to 1961. While the former was for reconstruction, this new plan focused on developing in a new direction and bringing North Korea into modernity. The first plan had been great for industry, but the common people still lacked food, housing, and clothing. Pyongyang was still too obsessed with heavy industry quotas over agricultural output. Both China and the USSR criticized Kim's plan and urged him to change it, but Kim stayed his course. The Chalama Ondong, or Flying Horses campaign, was Kim's way of ramping up production. It was a massive propaganda campaign to encourage productivity and gave out rewards such as medals for factories and workers who exceeded their monthly quotas. Workers could also be organized into teams and compete with other teams for maximum output. They may be communists, but even North Korea realized that competition could be good for the economy. The press was filled with these Cholima riders, whose hard work was held up as a symbol of true patriotism. Kim also took to visiting production sites to encourage and inspire the workers, which became huge propaganda features for the regime. Another key part of Kim's motivation campaign were on-the-spot guidance visits, where Kim himself would visit farms, factories, or other facilities to motivate workers. According to the propaganda, he would use his immense wisdom to instruct the workers how to be better at their jobs and achieve their quotas. On-the-spot guidance has become one of the most iconic parts of regime propaganda and has been kept up by all of Kim Il-sung's successors. Their motivation campaigns were combined with nationalization and reorganization that tightened state and party control of the economy. By 1958, North Korea had collectivized every farm, and by the following year, it had reached full nationalization of all industry and trade. The obsession with quotas and productivity also had its dark sides. The pressure to exceed and expand led to punishment and social consequences for workers or teams who fell behind. The government even started a drink no soup campaign, encouraging workers to not eat or drink as much, so they wouldn't have to go to the bathroom during work hours. The 5-year plan, success or failure? So, was it all a success? It's not so simple. The more Kim pushed, the more the workers were exhausted. The quality of work started to decline, even as the quantity increased. Kim complained that companies were being lazy and would rush to meet their monthly quotas with shoddy workmanship of goods and materials. And by the late 1950s and early 1960s, production growth had stalled again. In theory, by 1959, North Korea had met its production quotas, and the government declared the plan completed ahead of schedule. The big picture numbers definitely looked great. The North's per capita GDP was $140, well above the South's $81, and many industries had seen increases in production by 50% or more. However, the GDP was inflated by industrial output at the expense of the food, clothing, and housing that Kim claimed to prioritize. The average North Korean remained wretchedly poor, living in temporary shanty towns, and many of them suffered from malnutrition. Industrial development came before the well-being of the people. The state also altered the numbers to not count industries such as coal, steel, copper, and fertilizer, which had all failed to meet their plan targets. Grain output was also curiously absent from the official 1959 statistics. It's telling that the government immediately planned a year of adjustment in 1960 to try and rebalance the numbers in preparation for a new phase of economic planning into the 1960s. And never again would North Korea publish thorough data about its economic situation. Songbun class system. Alongside economic reorganization, the 1950s saw a social reorganization with the introduction of the Songbun system. Songbun is essentially a caste system that is still upheld in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. It was launched in 1957 to distinguish between those families who were always loyal to the regime and those who were not to be trusted. There are 3 overarching classes in the Songbun system. The core comprise about 28% of the population, made up of those people descended from the original guerrillas and revolutionaries, the soldiers who died in the war, and those from traditional peasant families. This group is seen as the most loyal and trustworthy. They will be allies to the end. The largest group at 45% are the wavering. This includes the foreign-born population, families of defectors, members of the middle classes and their families, and a number of regular occupations like small traders and teachers. This group is not necessarily disloyal, but they cannot be trusted to be completely devoted to the regime. If things take a bad turn economically or politically, the regime knows that these people might turn against them. Lastly, roughly 27% of the population belong to the hostile class. Political prisoners, religious people, supporters of the South, or the descendants of businessmen and landlords all belong to this group. These people are not to be trusted and must be closely monitored for any hint of disloyalty or anti-communist action. Every North Korean is sorted into one of these classes, and then sorted into one of 50 subcategories within it. Those higher up the songbun scale can expect privileges, and having good songbun is the key to a good life in North Korea. On the other hand, those with bad songbun can expect to be discriminated against. Songbun affects everything: what jobs one can have, who they can marry, what healthcare they have, what schools they can get into, and even how much food is distributed to them. The regime maintains a file on every North Korean above the age of 17 to keep track of their songbun. Good deeds might move one up the songbun scale, but moving up is much harder than moving down. Missing work quotas, committing a crime, or showing any disloyalty to the regime are always bad for your songbun. Propaganda overdrive. Amidst this social and economic reform, the regime kept pumping out propaganda to tell citizens that they were fortunate to live in the greatest nation on earth. The regime claimed that North Korea was a paradise, free from the miseries that affected other, lesser nations. According to one kindergarten teacher, there was no such thing as blindness or deafness in North Korean children because those were failures of the pre-revolutionary world. According to school teachers, students never missed a lesson and never misbehaved. There was no such thing as alcoholism or prostitution in North Korea because everyone had what they needed and never had to stoop to such lows. Divorce? That never happened. Neither did premarital sex. And of course, it wouldn't be a communist utopia without a complete absence of homosexuality, which the regime saw as an anti-socialist perversion. The truth was quite different. The regime took care to hide its flaws from the eyes of the world, even its own people, while trumpeting its supposed success to the stars. But there was something sinister behind this image of perfection. One visitor to North Korea noted that, despite the war being recent and causing thousands of injuries, he never saw a single person who was scarred, mutilated, or disabled. The question was obvious. He said, "What have they done with them all?" The truth was that anything or anyone that made the regime look bad or questioned its image was taken out of the public eye. Some were merely hidden, but others would see the dark underside of the Kim regime. Punishment in North Korea. A regime like North Korea needed ways to punish dissenters, and the elaborate system of prison and labor camps first set up by Kim Il-sung's government are some of the most effective and terrifying examples in the world. It is easy to end up in a North Korean prison. The slightest accusation of disloyalty or anti-socialist activity from a party official or someone higher up the songbun scale could be enough for someone to be swept away by the police. Trials are little more than ideological performances, where the judge can berate the accused for being a traitor and enemy to North Korea before being inevitably sentenced to several years in prison. The North Korean prison system borrowed heavily from Stalin's infamous gulags. They were designed to handle not only regular criminals but political dissidents, whose only crimes were against the ideas of the regime. Virtually all North Korean prisons were and are labor camps. Inmates are subjected to forced labor to produce goods or extract raw materials for the regime. This ensures that the inmates' labor isn't wasted in idleness and, in theory, gives them labor skills and work ethic that those who are lucky enough to be released might remember when they return to society. Many prisons also serve as re-education camps. These places are known as kyowaso, Then there are concentration camps for political prisoners known as Kwanli-So. These are for the prisoners for whom re-education won't work, and only hard labor or total isolation are suitable punishments. Political rivals, such as those purged after the August faction incident, dissidents, critics, attempted defectors, and sometimes the more serious violent criminals, are likely to end up in these camps. Prisoners in all camps are subject to poor living conditions and barely enough food to survive. Beatings are a common punishment, and one former camp guard estimated that at least a third of inmates were mutilated, losing fingers, ears, or eyes to guard beatings. That same guard recalled that, as far as the regime was concerned, inmates are not humans, and there are no human rights protections for anyone in North Korean captivity. With Kim's power secure, the economy recovering, society realigning along socialist lines, and all of the opponents rapidly ending up in camps or graves, North Korea entered the 1960s with everything to play for. Challenges and triumphs. The Great Leap Onward. As the new decade dawned, North Korea continued to strive for economic and military progress. Kim still wanted to improve heavy industry and compromised on the policy of Juche to import equipment to support these economic sectors. The USSR was initially their main supplier, but friction over pricing and other issues led North Korea to do the unthinkable: turn to the West. Pyongyang realized that it was cheaper for them to buy industrial plants and machinery equipment from the West or Japan. Often these goods were of much higher quality than the Soviet models. Kim declared the Great Leap Onward policy, a way to use Western technology to jumpstart Korean development. They imported billions of dollars worth of equipment on credit, including $1 billion from Japan alone. Western businesses were happy to embrace a new market for the goods, and the fact that they were snubbing the Soviets didn't hurt either. In turn, North Korea used the equipment to establish the world's largest cement factory, as well as production facilities for steel, paper, fertilizer, and chemicals. Overall, the West went from almost nothing to being over 40% of total North Korea trade. These brief years of interaction in the 60s and 70s soon faded, however, when it became clear that the North Koreans, who had been buying everything on credit, were never going to pay it back. Defection of James Joseph Dresnok. This interaction did generate Western interest in the Hermit Kingdom, and a special temptation for a handful of men. Men like James Joseph Dresnok. Dresnok was a US soldier, and he'd had a rough life. His parents divorced when he was young. He never finished high school, and he had run-ins with the law before he enlisted at 17. He married young but returned from a deployment in Germany to find his wife had left him for another man. When Dresnok was redeployed to South Korea in 1962, he had lost all hope and was treating his depression with alcohol. It didn't help that his behavior earned him a court-martial either. With no wife, no career, and no future, Dresnok decided that life in the DPRK couldn't possibly be worse than his current one. So, on August 15, 1962, Dresnok ran across a minefield in the demilitarized zone and straight into the arms of some rather shocked North Korean soldiers. Dresnok was interrogated, but they soon realized that he genuinely wished to live in North Korea. After initial hesitation, the regime accepted him. Dresnok was given a home and became a North Korean citizen. He was one of at least 7 known US defectors to the country. In his new life in North Korea, Dresnok became an English teacher and sometimes acted in state propaganda films. He and the handful of other American defectors often played American soldiers in war films, and he became something of a celebrity in the country. Another defector, who later returned to the West, claimed that they were closely monitored by state security services, and were sometimes beaten or interrogated on suspicion of being spies. But if this is true, it did not seem to deter Dresnok. Dresnok lived the rest of his life in North Korea. He married twice and had several children before dying in November 2016. His children remain in North Korea, where they hold important jobs and plan to remain there for the rest of their lives. Military of Kim Il-sung. A few defections like Dresnok were not going to redress the military imbalance between North Korea and the US, though. In the 1960s, Kim focused on rebuilding his decimated military, using the rebuilt economic strength of his nation to rearm and upgrade his massive army. The government coined the slogan, "Arms in one hand, hammer and sickle in the other," to emphasize the importance of the military to their vision of the country. North Korea continued to recruit soldiers into its military. All eligible citizens had to serve 8 years in one branch or another. Most of its equipment was still being given to them by the USSR and China well into the 1950s. Maybe 5% of its annual expenditure went to the military, most in most nations, but not as high as it would be in later years. With no wars to fight, the soldiers were regularly assigned to work projects around the country, providing an easy labor force that could be deployed wherever the state needed them. On top of its obvious use, if war broke out, a strong military was a useful way to indoctrinate young people with state ideology. Kim wanted to inculcate military discipline in the next generation, and required all children to practice with firearms starting when they were 7 years old. This military resurgence had economic benefits too. Kim envisioned a militarily self-sufficient North Korea that could boost its economy by churning out a rifle for every citizen, and enough tanks, planes, and artillery to match the South and its American allies. This concept was called Byungjin, and argued that military development was deeply tied to economic development, and it has remained relevant in North Korean thought ever since. As the military grew in power, Kim purged unreliable officials. In the late 1960s, top military men like the Minister of National Security, the Chief of Southern Intelligence, and the Commander-in-Chief of the Navy, along with at least 10 top generals, were removed from power. This was less a case of them being a threat, and more a case of Kim simply tightening his control to replace these men with even more dependable allies. Communist power politics. While still providing economic aid to Pyongyang, Moscow and Beijing's relationship with the strange little regime was not smooth sailing. Moscow was still uncomfortable with Kim's personality cult, but it was China who was most unhappy with Kim. North Korea's poor performance in the Korean War had earned them a low opinion in China's political and military leadership, and the fact that China had to take up most of the manpower burden of the conflict created resentment against the Kim regime. Kim's tight control over the state also conflicted with Mao's enthusiasm for popular revolution. When Mao's Legion of Red Guard student activists launched the Cultural Revolution in 1966, waging a campaign of terror and vandalism against rival communist factions and symbols of Chinese tradition across the country, Kim Il-sung condemned them. To him, it was a dangerous act of popular unrest that risked undermining the stability of the country. The Red Guards had no love for him either, and dubbed him, quote, a fat revisionist who was not worthy of being called a communist. Korean DMZ conflict. Perhaps it was these wounds to his pride and questions about his credentials that made Kim Il-sung lash out at his enemies in 1966. Inspired by the work of the Viet Cong, Kim Il-sung devised plans for guerrilla infiltrators to slip across the DMZ and wreak havoc on the South. After over a decade of stalemate, it seemed he wanted to roll the dice on conflict once more. Incursions and even firefights along the DMZ were not unheard of, and there were usually a few dozen encounters a year. However, in 1966, these increased tenfold. There were almost daily skirmishes as North Korean guerrillas were caught in South Korean territory. As tensions rose, border guards became more on edge and started to resolve disputes with aggression and gunfire. This period is sometimes called the Second Korean War, but there were no major battles. Rather than a concerted campaign, it was hundreds of tiny skirmishes and guerrilla attacks. There were casualties on both sides, and the US declared the area around the demilitarized zone a hostile fire zone. Blue House Raid. By far, the most dire episode of the conflict was a daring and disastrous North Korean assassination attempt on the South Korean president. They were convinced that eliminating President Park Chung-hee wouldn't just weaken the South, but cause chaos from which the people would rise up, throw out the American occupiers, and embrace communism. On the night of January 17, 1968, 31 elite North Korean commandos slipped across the DMZ into the South. Their goal? Infiltrate President Park's residence at the Blue House in Seoul and eliminate him. Each man in the team had been handpicked and trained in infiltration. They'd rehearsed this mission dozens of times, and most of all, they'd been pumped full of North Korean propaganda. They avoided detection for several days until they encountered 4 civilian woodcutters. These civilians might have feared death, but they were saved by the delusional propaganda of the North. The Democratic People's Republic of Korea had assured its people that the southern masses were oppressed and eager to embrace communism. The soldiers simply explained the virtues of communism to the men, promised that they'd all soon be joined in wonderful communist bliss, and let them go. Naturally, the men immediately reported them to the police. Within hours, the warning was relayed up the chain of command. South Korea didn't know what the commandos wanted, but they mobilized everything in the area to find them, and put the whole country on high alert. The North Koreans managed to arrive in Seoul undetected, but they had to scuttle their original plan. They'd been trained well though, and adapted to the high alert. With soldiers everywhere, the commandos simply blended in. They donned stolen South Korean uniforms, and on the 20th of January, the full group of 31 armed men walked down the street in open daylight towards the president's residence at the Blue House. The commandos got within 800 meters of the president's house before some curious policemen stopped them. It didn't take long for the police to see right through their disguises. Their cover blown, the commandos opened fire. 1 policeman died and 2 North Koreans fell before the commandos scattered. A massive manhunt was launched in the following days. South Korean and American forces swept the city and countryside, hunting down the scattered commandos. Of the 31 commandos, just 1 escaped back across the border. 1 more was captured, but all of the rest were killed. The Blue House raid was an embarrassment for both sides. The North Korean soldiers had foolishly blown their own cover and failed their mission. However, had the 4 civilians not warned the authorities, it is possible the commandos would have succeeded. Even then, with Seoul on high alert, the commandos had gotten within 800 meters of their target before being caught. The Blue House raid could have been the spark of a major war, but by sheer luck, it happened to occur just as the Tet Offensive exploded in Vietnam, dragging away U.S. attention and guaranteeing that America would not commit to another war in Asia. For his part, Kim Il-sung denied involvement and blamed rogue elements in the government for the plan. But other actions by North Korea at the same time paint a different picture. The conflict peaks. A mere 3 days after the Blue House raid, North Korea captured a U.S. recon ship off the coast of the peninsula. The USS Pueblo was performing intelligence gathering several miles off the coast when it was intercepted by the North Korean Navy and Air Force. Officially, the Pueblo was in international waters, but North Korea has always asserted a much larger sea border than other countries accept. The North Koreans pursued the ship when it tried to flee and fired several warning shots, killing 1 sailor before the Pueblo surrendered and its crew was taken prisoner. It took several days to confirm the ship's fate, and Washington scrambled for a response. They desperately wanted to avoid making things worse. Not only might the hostages be killed, but U.S. resources were consumed dealing with the Tet Offensive in Vietnam. All the while, the crew suffered the misery and torture of North Korean captivity. The North began stockpiling rations, and in early 1968, Pyongyang closed its schools and evacuated citizens to the countryside in anticipation of a nuclear attack. Over 100 infiltrators were sent to the south again in late October, but almost all of them were caught within weeks of an operation that left about 150 people on both sides dead. The murder of an entire family at Jabang Mountain by the infiltrators, including a 10-year-old boy, intensified the South Korean response and made hope of a South Korean pro-communist uprising even more absurd. The global community feared war. Diplomats from communist, capitalist, and non-aligned nations urged de-escalation. Even Moscow was unhappy. During a party conference in April 1968, Premier Brezhnev condemned North Korea for trying to drag the world into another conflict. We do not know what exactly led Kim Il-sung to wind down the provocations in 1969. The anger of the USSR and China, fear of actual conflict, or a changing domestic political and economic situation might all explain it. We only know that, for whatever reason, Pyongyang eased off on the provocations over the following months, and by late 1969, the crew of the Pueblo were released, and hostile encounters along the demilitarized zone had returned to their pre-1966 levels. It is possible that Kim's massive military buildup in the 1960s created the appetite for war. It is also likely that the purge of North Korean generals in the late 1960s was a direct result of the failures of this whole conflict. Overall, though, it was a pointless conflict that claimed an estimated 400 South Korean and American lives, along with hundreds of North Koreans. Prosperity in the 60s and 70s. North Korea's military fortunes were poor, but its economic prosperity at this point was not so dire. Per capita GDP in the North was comparable or even higher than that of the South well into the 1960s and 70s. More than just rebuilding, North Korea had upgraded too. Almost all homes had electricity by the mid-1970s, and almost 70% of the population had urbanized as agricultural improvements reduced the need for people to be rural farmers. Education also improved, with virtually all children enrolled in school, and over 200 universities established across the country, all with free tuition, of course. One of the biggest success stories in North Korea was and remains national health. The hospitals remain underfunded. However, mandatory health checkups and vaccination programs instituted under Kim Il-sung have left North Korea with an unusually high life expectancy and a low infant mortality rate despite its relative poverty. To this day, North Korea enjoys an average life expectancy of about 73 years, lower than the US or other developed countries, but considerably higher than other nations of comparable economic status. Still, Kim's promises far exceeded reality. He'd once claimed he would see North Korea where everyone wore silk, lived in a house with a tiled roof, and ate 3 full meals a day. North Korea had made progress, but this dream of luxury, a dream that was already reality for millions in the West, was still a distant hope. What's more, North Korea's progress towards that distant hope was about to come to a grinding halt. A desperate nation. Economic issues. By the mid-1970s, North Korea's economy was showing signs of struggle. The Chilima movement had exhausted its workforce, and production was steadily declining. Imports of advanced Western machinery had stalled when it became obvious that Pyongyang would not be able to pay its debts. Global economic challenges throughout the decade, including the 1973 oil crisis, had knock-on effects that shook the already fragile nation. In 1976, North Korea was forced to stop all debt repayments to the West, a dire sign of the state of the nation's finances. Manipulation of statistics also continued to be a problem. Success varied wildly in different parts of the economy, and already by 1968, the government had stopped publishing specific data on economic output to avoid scrutiny. Some industries like ceramics soared, and the government smashed these numbers together with massive underperformance in other industries to create the illusion of success for propaganda purposes. By not recognizing their failures, though, the government only made it worse, continuing to pour resources into overperforming industries when they could have been better spent elsewhere. Things were not all bad. By many metrics, life in 1970s North Korea was relatively good, at least in the first half of the decade. Residential construction projects had finally addressed the housing shortages that plagued the country since the war, and there had been undeniable development in both industry and agriculture. However, the North would soon fall rapidly behind its southern neighbors in terms of prosperity, quality of life, and industrial output. Pyongyang tried to save its flagging economy with the August 3rd Consumer Goods Movement, which was basically a campaign to get North Koreans to buy useless goods they didn't need and that didn't last, just to create demand and boost GDP numbers. Attempts to restart the Cholima campaign for the movement failed. The exhausted workforce produced poor products, which meant even more had to be made to replace them, creating an endless cycle of decreasing quality and increasing demand that further warped economic statistics. North Korea's pride especially suffered as its old rivals in the South and in Japan began rapid economic rises that catapulted them ahead in the 1970s. As South Korea soared, North Korea became increasingly dependent on its Soviet and Chinese allies. By the end of the decade, North Korea was effectively a vassal state of the USSR, relying on them for economic subsidies and diplomatic muscle, and watching as its enemies soared ahead towards prosperity. Foreign policy changes. The shifting winds of global politics presented new challenges for North Korea. After the US's withdrawal from Vietnam, Kim entertained the idea of reunification with the South. If Vietnam could defeat the US, he argued, surely North Korea could. Kim presented this possibility to Mao Zedong, but this was not 1951 anymore. North Korea's military advantage over the South had shrunk dramatically, and the US's embarrassment in a guerrilla war spoke little of its power to win a conventional one. Furthermore, Beijing had not forgotten that their soldiers had shouldered most of the fighting burden after saving Kim's last disastrous war attempt. Frankly, they did not trust Pyongyang to win. The other reason they refused to support the idea was China's newfound effort to build bridges with the West. By the mid-1970s, China was looking for ways to reduce hostilities to the US and build economic ties. The Nixon administration had been eager to do so, hoping to deepen the divides between Moscow and Beijing, and allowing North Korea to start another war would only ruin those efforts. Kim's plans were shelved when he began to realize that the old reliance on China and the USSR in an eternal union against the West was crumbling. To counter this, Kim Il-sung found new allies outside of China and Russia. Fellow communists like Pol Pot and Cambodia were rather short-lived allies. One of the more successful areas of North Korean diplomacy was Africa. Kim found fast friends in the continent's mad dictators like Idi Amin and Jean Bedel Bokassa, men whose craving for power and control matched his own. Monique Nguema, the black girl from Pyongyang. Another appropriately psychotic friend Kim made was Francisco Mesias Nguema, the ruthless dictator of Equatorial Guinea. Nguema turned his country into his own little hellish cult. His official nickname was the Great Miracle, and priests had to give praise to him in every service. Of course, he shared the bloodlust of North Korea too. In one instance, Nguema had 200 people massacred in a football stadium while blasting pop music over the speakers. Equatorial Guinea was easily one of the worst places in the world to live. They called it the Auschwitz of Africa for good reason. As a sign of their friendship, Nguema sent his daughter Monica to be raised and educated in Pyongyang in 1979. It was just in the nick of time too, since Nguema was ousted and killed months later. But Kim Il-sung kept his promise to his depraved, departed friend. Monica was given the best education that North Korea could provide, and Kim regularly called Monica to see how she was doing, and made sure she had everything she wanted. Monica is still alive, and proudly considers Kim Il-sung to be her second father. She has written several books about her life and family, where she adamantly defends both Nguema and Kim Il-sung as good men who were unfairly smeared by Western propaganda. Operation Paul Bunyan. But while North Korea built closer alliances with some nations, relations with the United States and South Korea continued to be difficult. The DMZ remained a tinderbox that could be ignited by the simplest thing, including a tree. On August 18, 1976, a small group of US and South Korean soldiers, led by Captain Arthur Boniface and Lieutenant Mark Barrett, entered the DMZ to cut down a tree which was blocking the view for a UN command post on the border. A group of North Korean soldiers came over and watched them closely. After a while, the North Koreans became belligerent. They demanded Captain Boniface and his men stop and leave, but Boniface turned his back to them and kept working. He didn't even see the North Korean soldiers when they suddenly and brutally attacked him. About 30 North Korean soldiers, armed with crowbars, metal pipes, and other implements, pounced on the US and South Korean soldiers. Captain Boniface was beaten to death on the spot. Lieutenant Barrett escaped to a nearby ditch where the North Korean soldiers found him and attacked him with the same axes the soldiers had been using to cut down the tree. Boniface and Barrett both died from their injuries. Both men were armed but never drew their weapons, probably scared that gunfire would only make things worse. Immediately, North Korean state media spun the attack as an act of American aggression, and North Korea's international allies echoed this propaganda. Video, photographic, and eyewitness evidence refuted it, but the regime made sure that the North Korean people only saw their version of events. But if Pyongyang had hoped the US would back down, they were badly mistaken. The US refused to take the murder of 2 of their soldiers lightly, but they also didn't want to start a war over a tree. Cue Operation Paul Bunyan, named for the famous lumberjack folk hero. The US had a single goal. They were going to cut that tree down, and they were going to dare Pyongyang to try and stop them. The US called in an army's worth of resources. Hundreds of armed soldiers, martial arts specialists, armored vehicles, attack helicopters, a fleet of bombers, fighter jets, and not to mention the aircraft carrier USS Midway, which was moved to a station offshore. Practically every US and allied military base in East Asia was put on full alert, ready to assist if the North Koreans tried to stop them cutting that tree. With enough firepower to conquer a small country behind them, the US sent a team into the DMZ to chop down the tree once and for all. The few hundred North Korean soldiers on the border could only watch in awe as the US troops brought it down, while helicopters and bombers circled on the horizon. 45 minutes later, Operation Paul Bunyan was declared a success. The stump was left standing for a few years, and now a memorial stands on the spot to honor Boniface and Barrett. North Korea, apparently shocked by the lengths the US would go for a tree, didn't go so far as to apologize. But Kim Il-sung expressed his regret that the incident had gotten out of hand, and said both sides needed to commit to keeping the peace. It wasn't much, but it was the closest the Kim regime had come to accepting responsibility for something bad in its entire history thus far. Flagpole War. The Paul Bunyan incident didn't solve issues along the DMZ, not by a long shot, but subsequent disagreements were generally more civil. In fact, they could be downright silly at times. The Flagpole War of the 1980s was a good example, and it's exactly what it sounded like. South Korea erected a 98-meter flagpole near the border so that their flag could be seen by the North. Taking some lessons from the showmanship of their American rivals, the North answered back with a 160-meter flagpole that dwarfed their neighbors. The flag alone weighed almost 600 pounds, and to this day, this little sign of North Korean vanity is the tallest flagpole in the world. The emergence of Kim Jong-il. By 1980, Kim Il-sung was pushing 70. North Korea's economic progress had stagnated, and foreign relations had been stuck in a perpetual stalemate for almost 3 decades. There might have been a sense of anxiety about what could happen when the great leader died, and the nation faced its mounting problems alone. Kim Il-sung had a solution to those anxieties, and its name was Kim Jong-il. Kim Jong-il was hidden from the spotlight for the first 30 years of his life. Born in a Soviet military camp in 1941 to Kim Il-sung and his first wife, Kim's childhood is obscured behind a ridiculous level of absurd and fanciful stories. Kim Jong-il first emerged into the corridors of power in the 1970s, playing a key role in party politics, even as he was hidden from public view. He joined the Central Committee in 1972, and by 1974, he was the designated heir to his father. Il was groomed for succession through experience. He was given important roles in managing espionage and propaganda for the regime, and would gradually accrue more power behind the scenes until the 1990s. From the 1980s, he was put into public view and given a thorough, heroic treatment by propaganda. Soon, his portrait could be found alongside his father's in every home in the DPRK. Kim Jong-il was described as the party center, and state propaganda assured the people that, as Kim Il-sung's old age approached, the party center would maintain the revolution and continue the work that his father began. Kidnapping of Shin Sang-ok and Choi Yoon-hee. One of Kim Jong-il's first responsibilities was to coordinate propaganda to improve the DPRK's image. Despite his ideological opposition to Western ideas, Kim Jong-il was famously a huge film buff and owned a massive collection of foreign films that would have earned a regular North Korean a trip to the labor camps. Working with the propaganda and agitation department, Kim Jong-il dreamed of making North Korea a sort of communist Hollywood. Instead of themes of freedom or tales of cowboys and US soldiers like the Americans made, he dreamed of a film industry that sang the praises of communism and retold the glories of Kim Il-sung and his glorious revolution. The trouble was that North Korea didn't have the people to make films that could compete with Hollywood. Kim Jong-il made a few of his own during the 1970s, but any applause they got from the North Korean audience was forced. Kim knew he needed people with talent to make his dream come true, and he knew where to find them. In January 1978, North Korean agents approached South Korean actress Choi Yoon-hee while she was in Hong Kong. They shoved her onto a boat and took her back to North Korea, where she was given a tour of the country and met Kim Jong-il. Despite her kidnapping, Choi was treated well and spent time with Kim visiting theaters, operas, and parties across the country. 6 months later, North Korean agents swept up another South Korean film expert in Hong Kong, the director Shin Sang-ok. Shin happened to be Choi's ex-husband, and Kim intentionally kidnapped both to reunite them in North Korea and compel them to stay to make films for him. After several failed escape attempts from Shin, they gave in. Choi and Shin remarried and spent the next 8 years pumping out movies for the regime. Some of the films were exactly what you'd expect. Film productions of Kim Jong-il's own screenplays or tales of Kim Il-sung's glorious resistance against the Japanese. Choi even won an award for her performance in one propaganda film about a peasant woman joining the communists in Japanese-occupied China. But the best film had to be Pulgasari, a North Korean Godzilla ripoff about a magic dragon that overthrows a corrupt emperor. You can watch the film online. Kenpachiro Satsuma, one of the actors who played Godzilla, admitted that Pulgasari was actually better than some of the Godzilla films. Unfortunately, there would be no sequel. Choi and Shin were well treated, but they were still prisoners. During a visit to Vienna to secure funding for their next big hit, they managed to sneak away from their North Korean guards and escaped to the US Embassy. North Korea's film industry would never see wonders like Pulgasari again, but at least Choi and Shin could finally be free. Seed-bearing program. Choi and Shin were not the only people kidnapped and taken to North Korea in this period, and many would not have the chance to escape. Throughout the 1970s, Pyongyang kidnapped hundreds of foreigners and smuggled them back to the DPRK. Most of the targets were taken from Japan, although kidnappings from other countries like France and Malaysia were also known. There was no real pattern to them. They would occur at any place, at any time, sometimes taking young couples, other times a lone man or even a 13-year-old girl. The victims would be taken to North Korea and forced to live in the country for the rest of their lives. If they were abducted as a couple, they would be split up for a time and then reunited after a thorough indoctrination. If they were alone, they would eventually be paired up with another captive of the opposite sex. They would be given a home and expected to conceive children. That was the reason why they were taken in the first place. North Korea wanted those children to turn them into loyal spies. Marriage between North Koreans and foreigners were forbidden, and so racial homogeneity was almost universal in North Korea. Therefore, a spy who did not look like a North Korean was an extremely valuable asset to the regime. A similar tactic was the seed-bearing strategy, where young North Korean women would be sent out to seduce powerful foreign men like politicians and businessmen. They'd get pregnant, and then the North Korean government would use the children to blackmail the men to give them concessions or other support from their position of power. The ends of both schemes were similar: to breed a crop of ethnically camouflaged spies who could blend into society anywhere North Korea needed them to. To this day, we do not know how successful these spies were. We do not know of any of these children actually being used for their intended purpose. It's possible the plan was scrapped, or that they've been so successful that no one ever caught them. North Korea only came clean about the abductions in 2002 as part of a new diplomatic chapter with Japan. Still, the numbers they confessed to taking, no more than 13, are much lower than the numbers that survivors and others suggest. Just 5 of the abductees were returned to Japan later that year, and the fates of dozens of other missing people and their children are unknown. Rangoon bombing. North Korea's criminal behavior seemed to get worse in the 1980s, perhaps reflecting the newfound influence of Kim Jong-il. 2 horrendous terrorist attacks on foreign soil shocked the world in that decade, and increasingly isolated the DPRK. The first was an attempted assassination of the South Korean President Chun Doo-hwan during a visit to Rangoon, modern-day Yangon, in Burma. On the 9th of October, 1983, Chun, along with a host of other South Korean officials and advisors, was due to attend a wreath-laying ceremony at the Martyrs' Mausoleum, dedicated to several Burmese national heroes. At 10:25 a.m., just before the ceremony was due to start, a bomb hidden in the building by North Korean agents exploded. The blast destroyed the memorial, killing 21 people and wounding 46. Among the dead were several high-ranking South Korean officials, including the foreign minister and the deputy prime minister, along with journalists and Burmese civilians. Luckily for President Chun, his car had been caught up in traffic, and he escaped unharmed. North Korea was an obvious suspect, and police quickly identified 3 North Korean military officers who had secretly entered Yangon and received a package from a North Korean diplomatic mission, which was later found to have been explosives. Police closed in, but the suspects did not go easily. One suspect was killed in a firefight with police after taking down 3 police officers. The remaining 2 were captured after attempting to kill themselves with a grenade. One of these men, Kang Min-chul, avoided the death penalty by confessing the details of the crime and implicating the regime. The Rangoon bombing shattered North Korean relations with multiple countries, especially Myanmar, who were appalled that they would attempt not only to murder the leader of South Korea, but to do so at a sacred site within a neutral country. 1987 Korean Air Flight 858. The second and far worse crime occurred 4 years later aboard South Korean Air Flight 858. On the 29th of November, 1987, 2 North Korean agents working on Kim Jong-il's orders boarded Flight 858, using false Japanese passports and speaking Japanese taught to them by some of the captured Japanese citizens. The plane was flying from Baghdad to Seoul, with several stopovers in between. The agents secretly planted an explosive device disguised in an electronic radio in the luggage storage above their seats, then left the plane when it stopped over in Abu Dhabi. The plane continued on its journey, unaware of the deadly package it carried. A few hours later, the bomb detonated over the Andaman Sea in Southeast Asia, killing all 115 people on board. The agents tried to flee through the Middle East, but were caught in Bahrain. They both tried to commit suicide, but only one succeeded. The survivor, a woman named Kim Hyun-hwae, was detained and quickly linked to the attack. Investigation and interrogation soon revealed the truth. Kim Yon-wei had been taken from a young age and forced through North Korea's spy program, trained to be completely loyal to the regime. Kim Jong-il personally ordered her and her partner to bomb the plane to scare South Korea and frighten people away from the upcoming 1988 Olympics in Seoul. For her part, Kim Yon-wei was sentenced to death, but she was pardoned by the South Korean government, who argued that the indoctrinated girl was as much a victim of the regime as anyone else. It was a controversial decision, and Yon-wei lives with constant security out of fear of revenge from the victims' families or the North Korean government to this day. She has since denounced the regime and appears to be genuinely remorseful, but the decision to let her off the hook has angered many people. The murder of 115 people aboard Flight 858 was one of the most egregious acts of violence committed by North Korea since the Korean War. The international community was outraged, and the US officially declared North Korea a terrorist state. Of course, North Korea officially denies that it had anything to do with it, but the evidence against them is unquestionable. Mega projects. Clearly, the 1980s were a decade of external problems. Pyongyang tried to distract from these issues by funding massive internal projects to placate the people. Some of these projects were genuinely useful, others were mere exercises in vanity, and some turned out to be miserable failures. The Nampo Dam on the west coast of the country was the great internal achievement of the decade. Built between 1981 and 1986, this massive $4 billion tidal barrage separates the Taedong River from the Yellow Sea. It prevents seawater contamination of the river, allowing it to be used to supply water for human, industrial, and agricultural needs. It is undeniably a feat of engineering and is still a proud icon of regime propaganda, and a popular tourist destination to boot. But while the Nampo Dam had a purpose, the Juche Tower did not. The Juche Tower is a 560-foot tall monument to the regime's ideology in Pyongyang. It makes for a pretty sight, and it was an impressive 70th birthday gift to Kim Il-sung. But it was little more than a monument to the cult of the Kim dynasty. Then again, at least it was completed, unlike Pyongyang's other flagship 1980s project, the Rugyong Hotel. This 1,000-foot tall pyramid skyscraper towers above the city's skyline and was supposed to be an icon of a modernizing North Korea. It was planned to have restaurants, guest rooms, casinos, and lounges, all to attract foreign visitors and, crucially, foreign investment. What North Korea actually got was an endless money pit where construction and planning problems led the project to be abandoned. It was started in 1987, intended for Kim Il-sung's 80th birthday in 1992, but it was abandoned and is unfinished to this day. It was meant to be a monument to the nation's greatness, but instead, it stands as a symbol to the vanity and wastefulness of a regime that would waste billions on vanity projects while their countrymen sink into poverty. The collapse of global communism. Change hit the world hard and fast, and for all of its isolation, even North Korea would feel the effects. Under Gorbachev, Moscow became increasingly skeptical of North Korea and tried to push it to roll back its totalitarian control. Moscow's first formal delegation to Seoul in 1987 was also a disaster for the North's hard line against the South, and it forced Pyongyang to start its own process of diplomatic engagement with the South in the years after. Under Deng Xiaoping, China also rolled back its aggressive state control of the economy and embraced limited economic liberalization. This led China to open up to the West, leaving North Korea to become something of an embarrassing irritant to them. Beijing did not abandon its old ally, and economic aid continued, but diplomatic support for North Korea was less vocal as China sought a new place in the world diplomatic and economic order. Meanwhile, the rapid disintegration of the USSR in 1991 was as much of a surprise to its allies as to its enemies, and cut off a major ally for North Korea. As global communism collapsed, North Korea withdrew into itself. The regime re-anchored itself in Juche, insisting that North Korea's self-reliance was the key that would allow the nation to survive, while other communist countries failed. Given China's liberalization and Gorbachev's opening to the West, Pyongyang probably wasn't wrong on this point. Opening itself up to new ideas could well have been fatal for North Korea's totalitarian regime, and so the hermit nation doubled down on its isolation. Nuclear North Korea. The increasingly rogue North Korea sought protection in nuclear weapons. But even there, the new realities of world politics were clear. The North had been eyeing nuclear technology for decades. It had nuclear power plants, largely thanks to Soviet support, but it was still a long way from making nuclear weapons of its own. In the 1990s, the US began putting increasing pressure on North Korea to open up its reactors to international inspectors. In theory, North Korea's interest in nuclear technology was purely for energy purposes. The loss of fuel supplies and subsidies from the USSR had compromised the country's energy sector, but the risk of them repurposing it for nuclear weapons was obvious. Better, Washington argued, to stop them before they can repurpose that material into weapons than wait for them to do it. When the North suddenly withdrew from the International Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty in March 1993, it triggered the first global nuclear scare of the post-Cold War world. There were talks of nuclear war, and a North Korean diplomat threatened that his nation would, quote, turn Seoul into a sea of fire. Like every North Korean nuclear scare, the boasting came to nothing. They didn't have the will or weapons to follow through. Furthermore, a U.S. delegation led by former U.S. President Jimmy Carter arrived in 1994 and managed to convince Kim Il-sung to scale back the nuclear program if the U.S. agreed to provide safer, non-weaponizable alternatives for the DPRK's energy needs. For a moment, it looked like North Korea's path might change. The world had forced a readjustment. The DPRK had agreed to international help, and Western help at that, for a critical part of its economy. Even better, Kim agreed to host a meeting with the South Korean president in Pyongyang in late July 1994, an unprecedented diplomatic gesture. It was a glimpse of hope, the potential for a more cooperative North Korea. But that glimpse wouldn't last, and neither would Kim Il-sung. Death of the Great Leader. Just before noon on the 7th of July, 1994, 82-year-old Kim Il-sung collapsed at his private residence in Gyeongsang Province. He'd suffered a massive heart attack. The best doctors in the country were flown in to help him, but in the early hours of July 8th, the great leader of North Korea was declared dead. The state had secretly been preparing for his death for years. Arrangements for national announcements, public mourning, and an elaborate funeral were already in place. Still, tradition demanded that his death only be announced 34 hours later. Every North Korean remembers where they were when they heard the news of his death. Neighbors gathered around the only TV in the street to hear the news. Students were called together so the announcement could be made to the whole school. Production lines halted as the news spread through the factories. The 34,000 statues of Kim Il-sung dotted around the country became pilgrimage points for a nation consumed with grief. From the outside, the outpouring of grief for Kim Il-sung's death seems bizarre. Was it all for show? A performative act by people who knew they could be punished for not seeming sad enough? Or was it all genuine? A sign of the thorough brainwashing that North Korea had been subjected to by Kim's regime for the last 40 years? Eyewitnesses vary on their answer. Many people in North Korea had never known life outside of the cult of the Kim dynasty, and the loss of the great leader was an emotional blow that upended their worldview. There were others, of course, who saw him as a tyrant, even if they couldn't voice it. They knew what had happened to friends, colleagues, and family members who had dared criticize him in the past. Supposedly, Kim Il-sung's elaborate state funeral attracted 2 million people to Pyongyang. Video footage showed weeping crowds falling to their knees as the convoy rolled past. Women collapsed into the arms of their husbands as they visited Kim lying in state. Again, it is impossible to draw the line between what was real and what was for show. One person who was definitely on show was Kim Jong-il. For him, the funeral of his father was the first official act of his new regime. Kim was laid to rest in the Kumsusan Palace of the Sun in a glass coffin. where his embalmed body can still be seen by visitors today. He was also made Eternal President of the People's Republic, a symbol of his continual presence in the political and ideological life of North Korea. Reflecting on Kim Il-sung. With Kim's death, a new chapter of the nation's history was about to begin, but we cannot proceed without taking a moment to reflect on the man's life. Modern historians like to move away from the stories of great men, but Kim Il-sung was undeniably a special figure. His personality cult and practical power made him the most important person in his nation for half a century, and he used that influence to reshape the lives of millions of people. Few people ever live such an impactful life. Kim must have been disappointed. Despite his efforts to hide it, North Korea had fallen behind its southern enemies in prosperity, industry, technology, education, diplomacy, and more. The dreams of reunification seemed like a distant memory as Western military technology continued to eclipse their outdated Soviet-era weapons. Newfound diplomatic avenues between North and South showed that the North was starting to accept that its neighbor was here to stay. The continued economic rise of the capitalist nations, the liberalization of China, and the collapse of the USSR painted a grim picture for Kim's beloved Marxist-Leninist ideology. Many would say it was good riddance. Kim Il-sung directly or indirectly caused the deaths of millions of people between his wars, death camps, firing squads, and famines. For every person shedding a tear in the streets of Pyongyang, there were probably many more around the world celebrating the demise of one of the century's most brutal dictators. But if anyone hoped that the great leader's death would improve things in North Korea, they were about to be sorely disappointed. The reign of Kim Jong-il. The legend of Kim Jong-il. Kim Il-sung's death was rather sudden, but Kim Jong-il's rise had been anything but. Kim Jong-il had held an important place in the operation and propaganda of the regime for years. However, he was not his father. He lacked the true revolutionary pedigree and exciting life story of Kim Il-sung. If he was going to inspire the same loyalty and enthusiasm, his propaganda machine would have to work even harder. As a result, North Korean propaganda churned ridiculous stories about Il's life and skills to make up for his rather uninspiring life story. It was said he was born on a sacred mountain and a new star appeared in the sky to mark his birth, or that his mood could change the weather. According to the propaganda, Kim was a creator and an innovator. He wrote hundreds of movie scripts and operas during his life, on top of the many ideological works that flowed from his pen, like scriptures from the hands of a prophet. But maybe his greatest creation came in the 2000s, when he invented a reward for outstanding students: a piece of meat stuck between two pieces of bread. The West quickly ripped off this stunning innovation and called it a hamburger, but North Korea knows the real truth. Kim was also a peerless sportsman. During his first game of bowling, he hit a perfect 300. Then, of course, there was his legendary golfing talent. Kim hit 11 holes-in-one in his first round of golf in Pyongyang, and he was so good that he decided to never play again. Why would he need to, when he was already the best in the world? Even his toilet habits were mythologized, or his lack thereof. According to the government, Kim Jong-il never needed to use the toilet or attend to the basic bodily needs that mere mortals dealt with every day. It's likely that North Korean propaganda is bending the truth a little bit. In reality, very little is known about Kim Jong-il's private life. He possessed multiple mistresses and had at least 6 children, although more might have existed out of public view. Despite his image as a staunch North Korean patriot, his undying love of Western films was a poorly kept secret of his private life, and one of the only things we really know about his life behind closed doors. The propaganda made the new Kim out to be extraordinary, but reality was ready to put that to the test. The North Korean famine. Between debt, isolation, energy issues, and economic stagnation, it would have taken an extraordinary man to meet the challenges facing North Korea, and the new Kim did not measure up. The North's underlying collectivization policy kept the country on a knife's edge at the best of times. Therefore, when flooding caused crop failures across the nation in 1994, and with food aid from the USSR long gone, North Korea fell into a dreadful famine, which the regime euphemistically called the Arduous March. Hundreds of thousands of people began to starve. Social order broke down. The black market, already a ubiquitous feature of North Korean life, became a lifeline for malnourished families who were easily exploited. Many people were forced to migrate in desperate search for food. This was technically illegal, as the law required most people to have a permit to leave their town. But so many people had no other choice that there was no practical way to enforce the law. There were food riots in Hamhung and Sinuiju, and in some cities, roaming gangs of starving orphans took to the streets in desperate search of food. The famine had political consequences too. A group of senior military officers headquartered in Hamhung City, one of the worst affected areas, held secret meetings in autumn 1995. They discussed the idea of overthrowing Kim for his failures to address the crisis. State security services found out about the meetings, however, and all of the officers were arrested and shot. Kim Jong-il was characteristically evasive about the issue. In a December 1996 speech, Kim downplayed the famine as a food problem and was more concerned about the party's reputation than the suffering of his people. He blamed local party officials for failing to properly educate the masses in socialist ideas, which made them less loyal and was leading to social breakdown. He lamented that, quote, "the food problem is creating a state of anarchy," but failed to offer any real solutions to this crisis. Kim was even reluctant to accept food aid from China because he felt it weakened and degraded his country. The Shimwa-jo and the end of famine. In 1997, drought extended the famine for another year, but as the famine raged, Kim Jong-il kept scrambling to protect the regime's reputation. Kim made it illegal to utter the words famine or starvation in public or private. Violators could expect a visit from the Shimwa-jo, a secret police force established in 1996 to target those who tarnished the government's image amidst the famine. No one was safe from the Shimwa-jo. The agricultural secretary of the party was executed by firing squad on their orders. The general party secretary was tortured to death, and numerous provincial and municipal party leaders disappeared, never to be seen again. In all, over 10,000 people were killed, and another 15,000 were put into concentration camps by this shadowy organization. Despite their efforts to hide it though, international observers and NGO workers soon exposed the extent of the crisis. By the late 90s, Pyongyang was forced to accept food aid, which finally brought the crisis under control, but not before countless people had perished. Pyongyang's official estimate is that 220,000 people died during the famine. International observers insist it was higher, anywhere between 600,000 and 3.5 million. The Battle of Yeonpyeong Island. The famine might explain one of the biggest skirmishes between North and South since the armistice. North Korea was always unhappy with the armistice's naval boundary that gave South Korea control over several islands and valuable fishing spots in the Yellow Sea. With North Koreans starving, those fishing grounds looked awfully tempting to the regime. In June 1999, North Korea sent out small fleets of patrol and fishing boats across the naval boundary near Yeonpyeong Island. Naturally, South Korea responded with their own patrols, but neither side wanted to restart the war over some fish. For several days, North Korean ships would cross the boundary, antagonize the South Koreans, and then retreat back. Each time, both sides sent a few more ships and started to bring in heavily armed torpedo boats to intimidate their opponents. After a week of this, South Korea launched a bumping offensive. Basically, the ships started ramming each other. This carried on for a few days and ships on both sides were damaged. It was risky, since accidentally sinking a ship could make things worse, or one of the military ships could panic and turn it into a shooting offensive instead. Unfortunately, that's exactly what happened on the 15th of June. A North Korean patrol boat panicked after being surrounded by South Korean ships and opened fire with its cannons. The South Koreans shot back, and for 15 minutes, the war was back on. In the end, one North Korean ship was sunk, and 5 others were badly damaged. At least 17 North Korean sailors died, but the South Koreans only had a few minor injuries. The North Koreans limped back to safety. The Battle of Yeonpyeong Island was over, but the peninsula braced itself for the consequences and a potential restart of the war. Fortunately, nothing came of it. North Korea had learned its lesson for now. North Korea propaganda told the people that they had won a tremendous victory and sunk at least 10 South Korean battleships, and then quickly buried the event. Songun. The Battle of Yeonpyeong Island was a poor showing for the DPRK, which must have stung for Kim Jong-il. Although he never served on the front line himself, Il was obsessed with the military. He had been appointed to the Military Commission in 1980 and had been made Supreme Commander of the Korean People's Army in 1991, giving him years of prior experience overseeing military affairs. Kim's enthusiasm for the military was expressed through his ideal of Songun, or military first. Kim placed the military at the center of public life, ramping up military propaganda and placing its needs at the top of government priority lists. By Songun's logic, it was the military, not the common people, who acted as vanguards for the revolution, and it was they who were the key to North Korea's long-term survival. The military became the model for all of society. Military discipline, obedience, and loyalty were to be emulated by all people in all aspects of North Korean life. Propaganda re-centered the soldier and cast all citizens as soldiers in the endless war against the DPRK's enemies. Free markets in North Korea. Kim didn't neglect the economy either, but his indecisiveness and ineffectiveness did little to help anyone. Songun itself did provide some economic improvement. There were plenty of jobs to be had in upgrading the military, not to mention in conscription, but those alone weren't enough to address the country's obvious economic shortcomings. In 2002, international observers were shocked to see North Korea seemingly embrace market economics with the July 1st measures. Among a number of things, the July 1st measures adjusted the price of rice to follow the market, gave companies and managers greater freedom to purchase supplies in that market, and worked to establish official private markets for goods and services inside the DPRK. While hailed as a major reform in foreign media, in reality, the laws were little more than a legalization of black market trade that had been happening for years. They were an acknowledgement of the country's underlying problems, not a solution to them. The illusion of a new economic turn was furthered in 2004 with the opening of the Kaesong Industrial Park. This was a joint endeavor by North and South to improve economic ties. The Kaesong Park sits about 10 miles north of the demilitarized zone and allowed South Korean companies to employ North Korean labor to produce their goods. The wages were paid directly to the government, giving the North a useful source of foreign currency in exchange for cheap labor for the Southern companies. Although small in scale, it was a productive diplomatic step for the two Koreas, and was an unusually direct attempt by Pyongyang to harness the power of capitalist business practices. Despite the hope of foreign observers, these changes were not as significant as foreign media presented them, and Pyongyang quickly got cold feet. After a few years, they clamped down hard on market training, banning all working-age men and later all women under 50 from participating in it. These bans probably didn't have much real effect on black market trading, but it signaled that Kim Jong-il had not suddenly become a fan of free market economics. George Bush and the Axis of Evil. As North Korea entered the new millennium, it found itself increasingly villainized by the world. After 2000, the Bush administration took an increasingly firm line on Pyongyang and turned up their rhetoric. North Korea also faced renewed scrutiny from an international community that saw it as a relic of times past. One driver of this new scrutiny was Lee Soon-ok, a defector who had spent 5 years in a North Korean concentration camp. Her 1999 memoir told tales of forced labor, the torture of prisoners, mandatory abortions, and public executions. In 2002, as part of the Bush administration's harder line on North Korea, she was invited to speak to the US Congress about her experiences there, holding up the dark underbelly of Kim's Korea for the world to see. In 2002, Bush described North Korea, alongside Iraq and Iran, as an axis of evil. In the wake of the 9/11 attacks, the US was wary of rogue states like the DPRK sponsoring attacks on American civilians. Given Kim Jong-il's involvement with terror attacks, such as the bombing of Flight 858, it wasn't an unreasonable concern. The US's allies joined in its caution towards Pyongyang, and neither Russia nor China was strong enough to be an alternative ally to challenge the US, as they had during the Cold War. Nuclear North Korea. It's perhaps no surprise that Kim Jong-il continued his country's nuclear program amidst this hostility. The 1994 nuclear agreement spearheaded by Jimmy Carter failed to prevent North Korea continuing its nuclear missile development. The Clinton administration had tried to engage Pyongyang in negotiations to stall the development of ballistic missiles, but achieved very little. And Kim Jong-il became skilled at using the nuclear program as leverage to gain more economic aid. By 2002, the CIA believed North Korea possessed at least one nuclear weapon and had the capacity to create even more. However, the first known successful detonation didn't occur until October 2006. Reality still constrained Kim, though. His nuclear weapons would not solve the energy or economic crises afflicting his country. Pyongyang ultimately needed a functioning nation more than they needed nuclear weapons. And so, in 2007, after multiple conferences with the US, South Korea, Japan, Russia, and China, North Korea agreed to suspend its weapons program and shut down its main nuclear reactor at Yongbyon in exchange for diplomatic concessions and massive amounts of fuel and economic aid. It was a short-lived concession. The North refused to accept international observers to inspect its reactors, and continued to test rockets that could be capable of delivering nuclear payloads. When the UN sanctioned them, the DPRK announced it was resuming its weapons program and reactor operations in full capacity. The Won Revaluation Crisis of 2009. The biggest stumble of Kim's regime probably came with the disastrous money reforms in 2009. That year, Pyongyang had the bright idea of reforming the currency. It was standard fare for a communist regime, announced that all existing banknotes will be taken out of circulation and made worthless, and people have a short window to exchange them for new banknotes. However, Pyongyang set daily limits on how much currency people could exchange, which meant that most people would lose money by being unable to convert it in the short time frame. This was intentional. The regime wanted to reduce the money supply to reduce inflation, while wiping out illegal savings made by black marketeers and other criminals. The end goal was for the new 1 won to buy as much as the old 100 won. But economics is not that simple, especially not with Kim Jong-il at the helm. It seems that Kim Jong-il felt the reforms would punish loyal workers. After all, why should they lose money under the reforms? He had a solution. Every government employee, which meant almost everyone in the country, would keep the same numerical wage after the reforms as before. Of course, since 1 won would be worth 100 times more after the reforms, Kim was basically increasing nearly every wage in the country by 10,000%. Obviously, this was a catastrophe. The reforms produced confusion, chaos, and colossal inflation. Prices soared. The government tried to control them, but reality forced people to ignore the price caps. The regime was forced to close markets and shops to try and rein things in. Economic confusion and panic produced shortages of basic goods. These reforms affected everyone from peasants to generals, and perhaps for the first time ever, the idea that the regime might be overthrown became a real possibility. Foreign students remembered North Koreans openly complaining about the policy, and one North Korean diplomat angrily told a foreign representative that the government, quote, doesn't understand what it's doing. Never had criticism of the regime by its own citizens been so public or so widespread. By April of 2010, however, conditions had stabilized. As people figured out the actual value of money, the economy started to function properly again. Soon after, the government rolled back almost all bans on market activity and explicitly ordered local authorities not to intervene in markets except to deal with illegal goods. The revaluation debacle was almost certainly Kim Jong-il's doing. One historian described him as comically incompetent on economic issues, and only he could have proposed such an obviously stupid plan without anyone criticizing it. Several high-ranking officials, including the head of economic policy in the KWP, were scapegoated and executed or arrested, and the regime quickly buried the event and denied anything bad happened. It might not be the most exciting episode in North Korean history, but it might well be the closest the regime came to collapsing from within. Skirmishes with South Korea. Internal problems did not stop North Korea creating external problems for itself, though. Kim apparently hadn't let go of the dispute over fishing grounds in the Yellow Sea that had spilled over into skirmishes early into his reign. North and South again exchanged fire over fishing rights off Daecheong Island in November 2009, resulting in an uncertain number of North Korean casualties. Given the tension in the area, it was natural for South Korea to keep ships nearby. One of those ships was the ROKS Cheonan. On the night of the 26th of March 2010, the Cheonan was suddenly rocked by an explosion. The shocked crew scrambled to save her, but within 10 minutes, the ship had broken in half and sunk just off the coast of Daecheong Island. 46 of its 104 crew drowned. South Korean officials scrambled for an explanation. There were no reports of conflict or North Korean ships in the area. An extensive investigation eventually determined that a North Korean torpedo had detonated beneath the ship. Fragments of the torpedo were recovered, and it was concluded that a small North Korean submarine had fired on them. Pyongyang denied the accusation and was supported by both China and Russia. Counter-arguments claimed that the Cheonan had collided with the sea floor and caused damage that led to the sudden explosion, or that it had struck a sea mine. Several academic studies have failed to settle on an explanation, but South Korea and its allies continue to believe that North Korea was responsible. The sinking of the Cheonan caused relations to nosedive, and rhetoric on both sides heated up in the following years. These tensions led to another engagement between North and South at Yongpyong Island. When South Korean forces performed naval exercises around the disputed island, North Korea fired almost 200 artillery shells at homes and military installations, which killed 4 people and injured around 20. The South fired back and killed 10 North Korean soldiers before both sides ceased fire. The North blamed the South for provoking them with military exercises, while the South insisted that the North bore full responsibility for opening fire without just cause. It is possible that the North was trying to make a statement against South Korea's admittance to the G20 earlier in 2010. Whatever the reason for the attack, it's likely Kim Jong-il himself was involved. He had visited one of the artillery bases where shells had been fired from the day before, and such a blatant provocation would have needed high-level approval. But if Kim Jong-il really was committed to armed provocation, then South Korea was about to catch a lucky break. Death of a dictator. In 2011, death once again struck the Kim regime without warning. On the 19th of December, the government announced the sudden death of Kim Jong-il from a heart attack 2 days earlier.
김정일 동지께서 주체 100 2011년 12월 17일 8시 30분에 현지 지도의 길에서
It claimed he'd been traveling aboard his personal train when he suffered the fatal attack. South Korean intelligence was skeptical of this claim, since their spies reported that his train hadn't moved around the time of his death. But whatever the real circumstances of his death were, have been completely buried by the regime. As with his father's death, the DPRK was consumed with scenes of grief and distress. crowds wept as they listened to the announcement, and his funeral was an elaborate spectacle for the tearful masses. Once again, how sincere these displays were is up for debate. Kim Jong-il had officially ruled for less than half the length of his father's reign, and unlike his father, had not thrown out any Japanese occupiers or waged any wars against its great enemies. Il's reign was also one of clear economic deprivation, of famine, and of North Korea's further decline into a pariah state, and even the laughingstock of the international community, who only got taken seriously when it threatened to destroy the world, promises it almost certainly couldn't back up. Still, the propaganda machine didn't slow down for his death any more than it did for his life. According to the regime, storms paused and the sky glowed red at the moment of his death. He was given the posthumous internal title of Grand Marshal, a symbol of his focus on the military and a sign of how important the military had become to the regime under his leadership. It was time for a new Kim to take power. But unlike Kim Jong-il, who had almost 2 decades of experience in politics under his belt, the newcomer to the throne was untested, inexperienced, and an unknown quantity for the rest of the world, Kim Jong-un. The reign of Kim Jong-un. Kim Jong-un's origins. Unlike his father, Kim Jong-un was not originally meant to be his father's successor. His elder half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, was the intended heir until he embarrassed the nation by getting caught using a fake passport to visit Disneyland Tokyo in 2001. The new Kim had actually spent a large part of his childhood outside of North Korea. He spent most of the 1990s being educated in Europe, first in Switzerland and then in Germany. By all accounts, Kim Jong-un was a normal kid. Apparently, he was a quiet but generally pleasant young man, and no one could have expected that he was destined to be a totalitarian dictator. He loved basketball from a young age, and remains a fan to this day, and classmates remember he was into video games too. Kim returned to North Korea to study at Kim Il-sung University, and very little is known about his life until his father suffered a small stroke in 2008. This health scare forced Kim Jong-il to consider succession, and in 2009, word spread through the ranks of the KWP that a new heir had been chosen. Kim Jong-un stepped into the spotlight in late 2010. He was promoted to 4-star general despite having no military experience, and began attending events and on-the-spot guidance sessions with his father. Propaganda had signaled him as the heir apparent, but he was never actually announced as such before his father's demise. It must have been a shock to find power falling into his hands so soon, for him and everyone else in Pyongyang. Un's reforms. With a little grounding in the running of the country and plenty of foreign experience under his belt, it was no surprise that Kim Jong-un caused a change in North Korean government. A hallmark of Kim Jong-un's tenure has been a pivot away from the military and back towards the party. Party officials, not military officials, have increasingly become the most influential figures in government. The Permanent National Defense Commission was abolished in favor of a State Affairs Commission that focused less on external military threats and more on internal economic and social goals. This change has several root causes. The first might be that Kim Jong-un himself does not have strong military credentials. Unlike his father, who held nominal leadership positions in the armed forces and coordinated foreign operations for military intelligence, Un's military titles are little more than ceremonial. The decreasing emphasis on the military also reflected a changing world. The prospect of North Korea resolving any of its disputes with military force is more unlikely than ever. Plus, its enemies are now incomparably more advanced than them on the battlefield. There is no reason to expect the military to be the key to a prosperous future for the DPRK. That isn't to say the military isn't still important, of course it is. However, it is not the absolute priority of Un's regime as it was for his father, and the generals seem to have lost their place in favor of the party apparatchiks and industrial managers. The Purge of Jang Song-taek. Given the power of the Kim cult, it was perhaps inevitable that the biggest threats to the regime would emerge within the family. Kim Jong-un came to see one in his uncle, Jang Song-taek. Song-taek was a veteran administrator with decades of experience and many loyal allies in the regime. The prospect of him succeeding his brother, Kim Jong-il, had been a possibility considered by foreign intelligence and, it seems, in the corridors of power in Pyongyang. The old guard of Pyongyang cannot have been thrilled to be led by a young, inexperienced Kim Jong-un, so Jang represented a potential alternative. At first, Jang maintained significant power under his nephew's regime. He took a leading role in diplomatic relations with China and continued to exercise significant influence over policy. However, by late 2012, Kim Jong-un began pushing him out of power. He was moved out of diplomatic affairs and excluded from national security meetings. The breaking point appears to have been over fish. Jang and Un had a falling out over control over fisheries in the Yellow Sea. Details are vague, but the New York Times reported that gunfire was exchanged between forces loyal to Jang and those loyal to Kim Jong-un. Shortly after, Jang was stripped of his post, accused of treason, and arrested. A scathing 3,000-word statement declared Jang a traitor who worked to undermine the DPRK for decades. He was accused of countless crimes, ranging from conspiracy to corrupt the youth, right down to half-heartedly clapping. Jang was executed by firing squad on December 12, 2013. Some of Jang's allies also fell from grace, most harshly of all, the deputy security ministers. Oh Sang-han, who was burned to death with a flamethrower in 2014. It was the most high-profile purge in the DPRK's history, and a powerful statement of Kim Jong-un's power, which showed that he was no less ruthless than his predecessors. Kim Jong-un's image. That being said, Kim has tried to show himself as a softer, more friendly leader than his father. Kim Il-sung and Kim Jong-il had projected the image of a paternal but firm military leader with deep ideological commitments. Kim Jong-un, on the other hand, quickly established himself as more concerned with social and economic issues than military ones, and proved to be more open to foreign culture within limits. In July 2012, Kim shocked the world by appearing at a flashy pop concert in Pyongyang, complete with Western music and unusually scandalous costume choices for an overly modest North Korea. There were also performers dressed as Western icons like Mickey Mouse and Winnie the Pooh. Kim's companion to this concert also turned heads. His wife, Ri Sol-ju. Previous wives and mistresses had mostly been hidden from public view. So, Kim's public display of his wife was a surprising change. It suggested that this new Kim was more approachable, more human, and less detached from the world as his venerated forerunners were. Experts have attributed Kim's new style to his childhood in Switzerland. He grew up experiencing Western culture and hadn't expected to be leader, so it is natural for him to be less hostile to the West and less aloof than previous leaders. Basketball diplomacy. Nowhere has Kim's differences in attitude been more apparent than in his love of basketball. Kim's obsession with basketball has been lifelong. Schoolmates recalled that Kim was an enthusiastic basketball player and was often found sketching pictures of Michael Jordan in class. While he was generally shy, Kim was an entirely different person on the court, being more confident and competitive when playing than he ever was in regular life. Apparently, he had a room in his apartment in Germany filled with NBA merchandise and photos of famous players like Kobe Bryant. Unlike his father's love of Western films, however, Kim Jong-un has not been shy about showing his love for this iconically American game to the public. In 2013, legendary basketball player Dennis Rodman was surprised to receive an invite from Kim to visit Pyongyang. Rodman accepted and traveled there with several other players and a pack of journalists. This was the start of one of history's most bizarre friendships. Rodman has visited Kim several times, and the two enjoy a good relationship. Kim and Rodman have been pictured watching games and laughing together, and the two have exchanged gifts. In 2014, Rodman was roundly criticized in the Western media for singing Happy Birthday to the dictator.
Happy birthday to you. Happy birthday to you.
Rodman has continued his friendship with Kim and visited North Korea multiple times. While Rodman has no official diplomatic role, his ability to exercise soft power and potentially influence Kim as his friend or raise delicate issues directly has been considered a useful diplomatic tool. Although Rodman does not appear to have achieved any diplomatic progress with this friendship, it remains one of the most unusual anecdotes in the history of an already unusual country. Culture laws. Kim's acknowledgement of foreign culture is surprising, but it is tightly controlled and very limited. It might even be misleading since in many ways, Kim Jong-un is harsher on foreign culture than his predecessors were. He has instituted a variety of harsh cultural laws designed to protect against foreign influence and preserve North Korea's own culture. Many things that the regime deems to be anti-socialist have been all but outlawed. The internet is the obvious first priority for controlling modern culture. Only a handful of people in the country may access the global internet, and even academic institutions are not permitted full access. The average North Korean is only permitted access to North Korea's special internet service called Kwangmyong. Kwangmyong is an entirely isolated network exclusive to the country that allows the regime to control all the information its citizens can access. Outside of the internet, music, film, and fashion which contradict Pyongyang's ideals and sense of morality are banned. One of South Korea's most famous exports, K-pop, has been described as a vicious cancer by Kim, and the New York Times reported that 7 people had been executed for listening to or sharing K-pop music. Western fashion, typically seen as too revealing and immodest, is prohibited. Haircuts are also famously controlled too. There are 15 state-permitted haircuts as of 2017, all of them designed to be practical for the good socialist worker and free of the needless extravagance of a capitalist consumer. These laws may seem strange to an outsider, but they make sense to the internal logic of North Korea. To allow any uncontrolled aspects of Western culture to slip through is to risk the fate of the USSR or China, who collapsed or reformed in the face of Western pressure. Furthermore, the thorough commodification of Western culture is a blatant capitalist intrusion upon the North's continued commitment to socialism. In Kim's eyes, the K-pop itself isn't really the issue, but what it represents, a seemingly unstoppable wave of foreign influence that his regime must contain in order to protect North Korea's way of life. Day in the life of an average North Korean. So, what does life look like for an average North Korean today? Most people wake up, attend to their family, go to their state-assigned job, and savor their leisure time when they can. Propaganda speakers blare in the background, and state-mandated events or holidays occasionally disrupt life. But the average day for a North Korean citizen is not some alien venture. The average North Korean is far poorer than the average Westerner. They do not have access to the same diverse range of food, heaps of modern technology, fancy clothes, or other luxuries. As of 2019, just 26% of households had access to electricity, rising to just over a third for those in urban areas. Some of the larger cities have also seen increased automobile ownership in recent years, although the average rural family will never own a vehicle. Some of these more rural areas are truly undeveloped. Isolated villages might not even have running water, let alone electricity. Although most people live in relative poverty, there is a growing middle class in the big cities. A comfortable lifestyle with expensive restaurants and apartment stores are increasingly available to the middle classes, even if that middle class is a small percentage of the population. The contrast between rich and poor can be astounding. Defectors have always stressed that, above all, North Koreans are normal people too. The regime and its ideology are more prominent in their life than such things are for most people, but they fade into the background in the day-to-day. Like everyone else in the world, the average North Korean is more concerned about their family, their job, their love life, their friends and hobbies than they are about the ideological mission of their country. Many may believe wholeheartedly in it, and some certainly oppose it, but most people fall somewhere in between. As long as they can live their lives, politics is a secondary concern. Nuclear threats. It can be easy to forget that North Korea is a nation of normal people when most of our exposure to the country seems to come from its promises of nuclear destruction upon its enemies. Kim Jong-un has re-emphasized the old idea of Byungjin, applied specifically to the country's nuclear mission, believing that the economic future of the nation is inseparable from its ability to acquire nuclear weapons. Even education is pivoted towards it, with the best students encouraged to enter nuclear-related fields, and graduates frequently being snapped up by the nuclear weapons development sector. While Kim Jong-il had seen to the creation of his country's first nuclear weapon, Kim Jong-un's task was delivery. His regime has been especially interested in ballistic missile technology that would allow it to deliver those weapons onto enemy soil. Kim signaled his commitment to this early, even in the face of international condemnation. The launch of the Kwangmyongsong-3 satellite in December 2012 was roundly condemned because it was seen as a thinly veiled attempt to test ballistic missile technology. Since the rocket utilized the same technology, the launch led to increased rhetoric on both sides, which only worsened when the North claimed to detonate another nuclear device in early 2013. During a disarmament conference in Geneva shortly after, a North Korean diplomat even threatened the final destruction of South Korea. As has become a pattern for Kim Jong-un's regime, these provocative nuclear tests heightened tensions for a few months before ebbing away. It occurred again in November 2017 when the DPRK test-fired its first nuclear-capable ballistic missile, the Hwasong-15. The Hwasong test was critical because it proved that North Korea had missiles capable of hitting the continental United States. Cyber warfare. While its nuclear program grabs headlines, arguably Pyongyang's most potent modern weapon is cyber warfare. Even Kim Jong-il was conscious of the power of new technology and supposedly once said, quote, "If the internet is like a gun, cyber attacks are like atomic bombs." The North's cyber capabilities are nothing to scoff at. Pyongyang maintains an army of talented hackers that strengthen the regime in many ways, from running international scams to steal money, to hacking into foreign military databases to pillage data. A 2019 UN report estimated that North Korea had raised $2 billion from this type of cybercrime. Most people in the West first realized the power of North Korean cybercrime in 2014 when Sony released the Seth Rogen and James Franco comedy The Interview, a film where the clumsy heroes must infiltrate North Korea and assassinate Kim Jong-un himself. Pyongyang was furious, calling it provocative insanity and a most blatant act of terrorism and war. In response, DPRK hackers broke into Sony's systems, leaking emails, salaries, scripts, and even whole films that hadn't been released. The entire company was crippled for days in what President Obama denounced as an act of cyber vandalism. A more elaborate and damaging cyber attack occurred throughout 2015, when hackers spent months infiltrating the Bangladesh National Bank. They spent months creating backdoors into systems that allowed them to place withdrawal requests for massive amounts of money. The hackers attempted to withdraw almost $1 billion in February 2016 and made off with $101 million before security systems caught on. That same year, North Korean hackers stole over 200 gigabytes of top-secret military intelligence from South Korea in 2016, including detailed plans for a conflict with the North and an assassination plot for Kim Jong-un. Probably the worst cyber attack was a 2017 ransomware attack, where around 300,000 computers across the world were struck with a crypto worm. North Korean hackers targeted computers belonging to numerous organizations, ranging from Microsoft to the British National Health Service, demanding payment in Bitcoin for the attack to stop. It took over 7 hours for the attack to be contained, and several days for it to be fully stopped, and in that time it caused billions in damages. The world has adapted to North Korea's capabilities, and governments now take the threat extremely seriously. But it is only a matter of time until Pyongyang's hackers strike again. Education. Of course, building that hacking network requires education, and that is something that the regime has also taken seriously since its inception. Universal education was put in place in 1959, guaranteeing up to 11 years of free education, including costs of uniforms, textbooks, and other necessities for all children. Official statistics assert that almost all children are enrolled for education in North Korea, and while some surely slip through the cracks, all evidence supports the idea that education is one area that the DPRK has succeeded with. In 2012, Kim Jong-un expanded and adjusted that education provision. Now, the state guarantees 12 years of education on a 6-3-3 system of 6 years in elementary, 3 in middle school, and 3 in high school. Of course, propaganda is a big part of that education. The history of the revolution and the deeds of the Kim dynasty are mandatory subjects in school, but North Korean children also receive a robust education in literacy, mathematics, and other subjects that stand up to the education available in most developed countries. Higher education is more limited. Being so closed off, North Korea has a small community of academics and very little chance to participate in global academic debate. Higher education therefore focuses on producing practical skills, especially in fields that have military applications. The peak of the higher education period is Pyongyang's Kim Il-sung University. With 16,000 students, it is by far the largest and best-funded university in the country. In recent years, Kim Jong-un has opened the country to limited academic exchange. Several hundred students, mostly Chinese, are permitted to study in North Korea, although they are closely watched. Increasingly, the most exceptional and trustworthy North Korean students have been granted permission to study abroad. The regime has long recognized that North Korean education cannot match that available elsewhere, or else Kim Jong-un himself would have been fully educated in country. And these students offer a chance to bring foreign knowledge and skills back for the benefit of the DPRK. Tourism in North Korea. Students aren't the only people coming into North Korea more often since Kim Jong-un took power. As of 2013, tightly controlled and well-monitored tourist groups have been allowed to enter North Korea. This is no simple holiday. Regime officials travel with tour groups everywhere. Itineraries must be adhered to without question, and tourists may not ask unapproved questions or enter unapproved places during their time in the DPRK. Most foreign tourists will stay at the Yonggak-do International Hotel in Pyongyang. It has many of the amenities one would expect from a hotel: a restaurant, a pool, a sauna, and even a massage room. Guests might find it hard to relax though. It is generally accepted that the authorities spy on every guest, and the entire 5th floor is strictly off-limits to tourists, where many believe the North Koreans oversee surveillance of the guests. Tourists are ushered to carefully prepared propaganda sites around the country. These include the giant statues of the Kim family, great projects like the Nampo Dam, and a series of resorts, aquatic parks, and other tourist sites constructed in recent years. Despite the propaganda hurled at them, tourists report that the North Korean people are generally friendly and somewhat curious about foreigners. They are still careful not to utter anything that will send them to a concentration camp, but tourism has allowed North Koreans to see that those beyond their borders aren't the destructive monsters that state propaganda depicts them as. Otto Frederick Warmbier. The rules governing tourism are rigidly enforced, as one American college student learned in the most tragic way. Otto Frederick Warmbier was a bright and friendly American college student who loved to travel. In December 2015, he took the opportunity of a lifetime to visit North Korea. After a whirlwind 5-day tour, Warmbier was ready to go back home with the other members of his tour group. However, as he waited in the terminal, 2 North Korean soldiers approached him and took him away. Warmbier's life and that of his family were about to change forever. Warmbier was accused of stealing a propaganda poster from Yonggak-do Hotel. This is extremely illegal in North Korea and is seen as an attack on the regime. No one knows what Warmbier experienced in captivity. All we have is a confession where Warmbier claims that the US government put him up to the crime and had manipulated him into attacking the DPRK. The absurd confession didn't save him, and Warmbier was sentenced to 15 years in a labor camp.
How I was used and manipulated.
저는 남들이 저분을 위해서 이런 분들을 범하게 되었습니다.
Please,
이에 대해서
act to save me.
저를 살해주시지 않아.
Please save my life.
저희 생명을
The US government continued to negotiate for Warmbier's release, and finally got it 17 months later in June 2017. But something was horribly wrong. The North Koreans informed them that Warmbier had fallen into a coma back in April 2016. They blamed food poisoning. Warmbier was breathing, but was completely paralyzed and unresponsive, and was only kept alive with a feeding tube. Warmbier was flown back to the US, but there was nothing anyone could do. Doctors believed his brain had been deprived of oxygen, causing permanent brain damage. One suggestion was that the North Koreans used water torture on him. Other Americans who had been in North Korean captivity had suffered it, and one man admitted to seeing a young American boy matching Warmbier's description, left unconscious and covered in water, being dragged through a prison. With no hope of recovery, Warmbier's feeding tube was removed on June 19, 2017. The US government condemned North Korea for his death, but the regime played the victim. They called the news reports a smear campaign, and said that they had only ever shown mercy to a, quote, criminal of the enemy's state. Escaping North Korea. With everything we've heard, it's no surprise that so many people want to get out of North Korea. People have been escaping North Korea since its inception. The number of successful North Korean defectors has varied over time. It peaked at several thousand per year, with at least as many failed attempts under Kim Jong-il, before declining sharply under the tighter policies of Kim Jong-un. In 2022, just 67 defectors made it to South Korea. This decline has been driven almost entirely by improved border security along the few possible escape routes. The most obvious but risky escape route is across the DMZ. The border with South Korea is watched carefully by soldiers, and is covered in barbed wire fences, watchtowers, and even minefields. An alternative route is across the northern border with China. This border is watched too, with barbed wire and guard patrols covering huge parts of the border, but not all of the terrain can be easily watched. Mountainous passages and sheer cliffs offer a chance to slip by unnoticed. Guards can sometimes be bribed too, but it's risky. Even if a defector can get into China, they're not safe. The Chinese government has a standard policy to deport all defectors back to North Korea. Instead, the defectors must travel through China and enter Southeast Asia. Some go by land, while others follow the Mekong River until they reach the safety of countries like Thailand. Sea escapes to the Philippines are also known. When they reach a country that won't deport them to North Korea, the defectors can present themselves to authorities. South Korea had a long-standing program to take in defectors from anywhere, and will make arrangements for these escapees to settle in their country. Anyone who is caught while attempting to escape can expect harsh punishment. Many will just be shot on sight. An underground network has sprung up to aid defectors, but the new policies make this riskier than ever. Ha Jin-woo, an activist who helps other defectors escape via China, estimated for the BBC that the success rate for defection has fallen from about 50% under Kim Jong-il to less than 10% in recent years. Assassination of Kim Jong-nam. In reality, there is little hope of safety or escape from the regime, not even for the leader's own brother. Kim Jong-un's elder half-brother, Kim Jong-nam, lived a mostly private life, traveling around the world since being passed over as heir. He lived in several places around the world and enjoyed a comfortable life thanks to his family's wealth. However, he was candid in his criticism of his half-brother's regime, telling one Japanese journalist that, quote, "Without reforms, North Korea will collapse." Nam's frankness and his brother's vengeance caught up with him in February 2017. While waiting for a flight at Kuala Lumpur Airport in Malaysia, two women approached Nam. One threw a bottle of liquid at his face, while another covered his mouth with a damp cloth. After a brief scuffle, the two women ran away, and Nam immediately suspected he'd been poisoned. Nam was right. The women had attacked him with a VX nerve agent, a highly illegal chemical weapon that is banned in most countries. Nam rushed to get medical aid, but within 20 minutes, he was dead. It did not take long to determine his identity, and authorities were quick to conclude that this was an assassination. The two women were identified as a Vietnamese citizen and an Indonesian citizen, but when they were questioned by police, they claimed they knew nothing about a nerve agent. Both women claimed they'd been approached to take part in a prank show and had performed several pranks on unsuspecting people before this. It is believed that Kim Jong-un had a standing order for his half-brother's murder. North Korean agents recruited the two women under false claims of working for a TV prank show and had them perform several pranks to trick them into thinking it was real. Murder charges were dropped against the women, but the agents who put them up to the act have never been caught. Kim and Trump reconciliation. Clearly, dealing with North Korea is always a delicate and dangerous endeavor. Naturally, the election of the very undelicate Donald Trump as US President in 2016 caused some concern regarding the Korean issue. Kim Jong-un did not give up his nuclear tests in the face of this new, unpredictable leader, and Twitter became the bizarre new avenue for Trump's unique brand of diplomacy, where he famously threatened North Korea's Little Rocket Man with his much bigger and more functional nuclear button. We do not know what North Korea thought about this new approach. However, following heightened tensions from the Hwasong missile test in 2017, Korea's diplomatic tune suddenly changed. The North sent a delegation to the Winter Olympics in Seoul in early 2018 and extended an invite to the South Korean President Ban Ki-moon to visit the North. The leaders of both Koreas also met at the demilitarized zone and agreed to work towards denuclearization of the peninsula. This was followed by an agreement between Kim and Trump in Singapore in June, where Trump echoed the commitment to denuclearization and agreed to scale back military exercises as a sign of goodwill. Maybe it shouldn't be a surprise that such an unusual president would be the key to making progress with an unusual nation. In June 2019, Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un had an unprecedented meeting at the DMZ, where they discussed plans for further de-escalation and additional talks in the near future. For a while, things seemed to be looking up. Unfortunately, these talks broke down in October 2019, and a hope for a new age of North Korean relations collapsed. Kim was not ready to make concessions on the nuclear issue, and he soon resumed his tests, in spite of American and South Korean protests. Once again, the nation would retreat inwards, continuing to cut itself off from the outside world and maintaining its own tightly controlled bubble, where its citizens' abilities to move, work, or even voice opinions was restricted in the name of collective security. Little did anyone know, this state would soon describe most of the world. North Korea and COVID-19. North Korea's isolation proved to be a blessing in January 2020 when COVID-19 hit. With entry to the country already under strict control and borders vigilantly watched by soldiers, it was easy for North Korea to seal itself off from the pandemic. Officially, North Korea avoided COVID for the whole of 2020 and 2021. Outside sources are skeptical that it was completely free, but no evidence of any widespread pandemic exists for the first 2 years. In fact, not much evidence for anything exists for those years from North Korea. Foreign governments had bigger concerns, and the North had no interest in opening up and letting the virus through, so we know even less about what happened there than we usually do. We do know that North Korea took COVID extremely seriously. Strict lockdowns were put in place, and thorough quarantine procedures were established for anyone with symptoms resembling COVID. When a single COVID-19 case was rumored in the city of Kaesong, Kim Jong-un locked down the whole city for 3 weeks. It was a false alarm, but it shows how harsh Kim's response to the pandemic was. It was reported that violators of North Korea's movement restrictions were executed, and in one case, the North Korean Navy killed a South Korean fisherman and sunk his ship because he posed a COVID risk. International trade almost completely stopped, and the regime rolled back its public parades, citing health concerns. However, given how tightly controlled life usually was in North Korea, the pandemic was much less of a change there than it was for most people in the world. North Korea's late pandemic. However, these measures weren't enough to escape entirely. North Korea announced its first COVID case to the world on the 12th of May, 2022. The government declared a national emergency, and Kim issued a statement saying that the nation faced its greatest challenge since the revolution. With reports of starvation due to food shortages on top of North Korea's poor medical system, outside observers feared a catastrophe. The fact that Pyongyang had turned down multiple vaccine offers was also a big concern. North Korea insisted that other countries that needed them more get them first, although some saw the stubbornness of Juche ideology at the core of their refusal, and there were fears that this decision would backfire. Fortunately, North Korea only faced the much less deadly Omicron variant. What happened next is up to whether you trust government statistics. Although almost 5 million cases were reported in a matter of months, hitting 20% of the country's population, only 74 people were reported to have died, and the pandemic fizzled out by September. Most scholars on the topic believe the actual death toll is higher, probably in the thousands, but probably far smaller than the death toll seen in South Korea, or other countries that face the deadlier early waves. Like the rest of the world, North Korea emerged from the pandemic shaken and facing the prospect of a new and uncertain future. North Korea in 2023. 2023 has been a relatively quiet year for North Korea. It has continued its missile tests and issued its usual blustering statements about destroying the US and South Korea if they provoke them, but nothing out of the ordinary. In May, they tried to launch their first spy satellite based on technology from its ICBM project, but the rocket crashed into the sea after launch. They tried and failed again in August, and will no doubt try further tests in the future. North Korea grabbed headlines in late July with the rare defection of a US soldier across the border. Private Travis King was stationed in South Korea and was taking a walking tour of the border when he suddenly ran away from his group and crossed into North Korean territory. King, who is black, blamed racism and mistreatment in the US for making him defect. In truth, it probably had to do with him facing punishment for an assault he committed in South Korea. King was released back to US custody in September, and his fate is yet to be decided. Pyongyang has also grabbed headlines for its tacit support of Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Kim Jong-un met Vladimir Putin in September to discuss the possibility of supplying weapons for the war effort. Kim, like Putin, sees the conflict as a proxy war against its great enemies in the United States and NATO. Things are quite different today than from the 1950s, but Pyongyang and Moscow still see themselves as allies in an endless confrontation against the capitalist Western powers. Whether that war ever comes, and whether the Kim regime will be around to see it, is anyone's guess. The future of North Korea. It has been said that North Korea has two paths to collapse: to reform or not to reform. To continue unchanged will inevitably bring about collapse as the world leaves it behind, but mismanaged reform that doesn't do enough or does too much too quickly risks toppling the system altogether. Back in 2011, Kim Jong-nam, who might be expected to have known a thing or two about his family's regime, commented that, the North Korean leadership is stuck in a bind. Without reforms, the country's economy will go bankrupt, but reforms are fraught with the danger of systemic collapse. Kim Jong-un seems to be trying to forge a middle path. Kim's internal shift away from military power, his openness to tourism and education, and his embracing of modern technology and some limited foreign culture hint at a prospect of change. However, the ever tighter grip the regime wields over its people, its stronger border enforcement, and its continued nuclear threats show that Pyongyang is far from ready to set aside its old ways and seek a new path of peace and cooperation. As global tensions increase between the West and both Russia and China, North Korea continues to be anchored to its old allies, even if it increasingly feels like a bizarre relic of a bygone era. Meanwhile, the contrast between North and South is extreme. Per capita income in the South is about 15 times higher than the North, by far the largest income gap between two nations that share a land border anywhere in the world. To put that in context, the much-touted disparity between West and East Germany that helped inspire the toppling of the Berlin Wall was an income ratio of 3-to-1 in favor of the West. The shock so many North Korean defectors feel upon reaching the South is entirely unsurprising. Many people have tried to predict where North Korea will go, and many people have been wrong. For now, North Korea is here to stay. It shows no sign of imminent collapse, and no one has the inclination to force it over the edge either. Still, its economic failures and its inability to keep up with a changing world might one day spell the end for this peculiar little country, or at least for its government.